Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world of hushed whispers, swinging censers and candlelit corners where sin was always watching, and almost everyone was guilty. You're about to wander through the bizarre, frustrating, sometimes funny, sometimes devastating history of medieval sex laws versus how people actually lived and loved. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this era, not because of plague or war, but because even your private thoughts might get you hauled in for unnatural desires. And I mean that literally. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, what time is it where you are? Drop your city and hour in the comments. I like to imagine who's curled up under what kind of sky while we do this weird little historical time travel together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a small village somewhere in 13th century England. It smells like sheep, onions, and the distant threat of firewood that never quite dries. The church bell rings in the square, dragging a low moan through the air, calling everyone to morning prayer. Your cloak itches. You haven't bathed in weeks. But that's not the problem. The problem is that you had a dream last night. A sinful one. The kind that would send a monk into fits of rage and a confessor into a long, awkward silence. You didn't choose it, but good luck explaining that when you kneel in front of the altar and the local priest starts asking if you've let the devil into your thoughts. Here's the thing. In medieval Europe, especially from about the 11th to the 15th centuries, the church wasn't just guiding behaviour, it was micromanaging the soul. Sex in any form was treated like a radioactive material, dangerous, powerful, and ironically, always under watch, but never truly contained. Officially, the church taught that sex was only acceptable between a married man and woman, only for the purpose of making babies, and only in a very specific, unimaginative position. That was the rule. But no one, and I mean no one, followed it completely. So you grow up in a culture that drills into your skull that lust is the gateway to eternal fire. Your village priest quotes St. Augustine like a medieval meme. Lust indulged became habit, and habit unresisted became necessity. And yet, at the market, at the alehouse, behind barns, or even in the choir stalls, people are very much doing it anyway. You notice it early. Your neighbour's daughter has a baby 3 months after getting married. The midwife rolls her eyes. No one says anything, but everyone knows. You see the butcher sneaking off with the widow from 2 doors down. You catch the local monks exchanging nervous glances during Mass. People laugh about it in low voices. Sin is always a joke, until it's not. Because here's the trap. The laws were everywhere, written into both canon law, that's the church's rules, and civil law, the king's domain. But enforcement was messy, inconsistent, and full of double standards. One law might condemn premarital sex as mortal sin, while another allowed a nobleman to buy his way out of punishment with a simple donation. A poor peasant girl. She gets public penance, barefoot, weeping, and carrying a candle through the streets. That actually happened. In some towns, priests would quiz children during catechism about what their parents did in bed. Confessors had handbooks, actual little leather-bound manuals that listed every sexual sin imaginable, with specific penances assigned. Things like 10 years of fasting bread and water for unnatural congress. But what exactly counted as unnatural? Well, that's still up for debate. Even medieval scholars disagreed. Some thought even enjoying the act too much could damn you. Others were more lenient, especially if you were nobility, or if your sins brought tithes to the church. There's one bizarre historical fact that always sticks out here. In some parishes, they believed demons could get you pregnant. Seriously. If a woman gave birth out of wedlock and insisted no man had touched her, some priests were like, well, bro, that sounds like an incubus situation. Handy excuse, right? And yet it also shows just how deeply confused the culture was, desperate to maintain control while also totally aware that everyone was breaking the rules. But the truth was, the laws weren't really about morality. Not entirely. They were about power. The church wanted to dominate not just your actions, but your desires, your private thoughts, your nighttime dreams. That's why confession was such a big deal. It wasn't just about forgiveness. It was surveillance, mental and spiritual. You confess, you get back in line. You sin again, you confess again. The cycle becomes your life. And somewhere in all of this, between fear and desire, shame and rebellion, Real people tried to love each other, clumsily, secretly, sometimes tragically. A peasant boy leaves a wildflower on a girl's doorstep. A merchant's wife stares a little too long at the travelling bard. A widow wonders if she can remarry without being branded greedy for wanting touch again. You see it all in your village, though no one speaks openly. Everything's a glance, a whisper, a rumour, and that makes the whole thing more intense, more human. Because under all the laws, people are still people, curious, lonely, reckless, tender. It's not just the peasants, even kings get caught. There's a whole back channel of gossip around court affairs, royal bastards, and highborn ladies sneaking off with stable boys. The church grumbles, penances are handed out, then everything goes back to normal, until the next scandal. So here you are, lying awake in your tiny hay-stuffed bed, wondering if the dream you had last night is going to stain your soul forever. You haven't even touched anyone. But the guilt is already there, creeping into your bones like the damp from the stone floor. You close your eyes, the bell rings again, another day of rules, and another night of temptation, and the gap between what's preached and what's practiced, it just keeps growing wider. You walk past the village church again the next morning, head low, trying to remember what the priest said last Sunday. Something about the sin of lust lurking at the door, something about keeping one's heart pure and mind focused on heavenly things. Meanwhile, Brother Thomas was clearly staring down the dress of the baker's wife. Again, that contradiction, it's everywhere. But let's take a moment to talk about what the church actually banned. You might assume it was just a basic no sex before marriage kind of vibe. Oh no, it was a comprehensive body and soul level instruction manual of what you could and couldn't do in bed. And spoiler, it banned almost everything. To start, the church claimed the only proper use of sex was between a married man and woman for the purpose of procreation. That's it. Pleasure, dangerous. Orgasm, suspect. Any position other than missionary, definitely sinful. This wasn't just opinion, it was policy. Canon law, backed by centuries of church councils and edicts, dictated that sex must be both lawful and sterile in emotional tone. So even if you were married, you were only supposed to do it when both of you were relatively disinterested and mostly thinking about babies. Sexy, right? But wait, it gets weirder. The calendar itself was littered with no-sex days. Fridays, Sundays, and Wednesdays were often off limits. So were feast days of saints, Lent, all of it, Advent, yep, that too, and any day you were planning to take communion. Which, if you're a good Christian, could be a lot of days. Some estimates suggest that up to half the year was considered a bad time for marital sex. That's not an exaggeration. Half the year. And it wasn't just when and why, but also how. Certain positions were off the table, literally. The church especially frowned upon anything they thought was unnatural, which included anything other than man on top, in the dark, eyes-closed marital relations. Oral sex, condemned. Anal sex, definitely condemned. Sex from behind. That was associated with animal behaviour and slapped with the label of bestial sin, even if it involved two consenting married humans. The term sodomy became a vague catch-all for all non-procreative acts. And boy did they toss that word around like it had a buy-one-get-one sin coupon. But here's where the rules got tricky, and kind of hilarious. Because while the church was loudly condemning all this stuff, they also had to define it, which meant writing it down. Which meant that by the 12th century there were detailed guides written by monks for confessors, listing all the possible sexual sins and the correct penance for each. Some of these manuals read like medieval BuzzFeed quizzes. Did you perform the act standing up? That's 3 years penance. Was it during Lent? Add another 3. Were you laughing while you did it? Double it. Take the Penitential of Burchard of Worms, for example, a real widely used manual from around 1000 AD. It included questions like, have you done what some women do, lying with a dog or a horse? Yes, that's a real line. They covered every possibility. Which makes you wonder, how did they come up with that list unless someone somewhere was doing exactly that? And of course, they had to define what counted as intercourse. That was a real scholarly debate. Some clerics believed that even kissing with lustful intent was sexual. Others said the sin began only at climax. There was no consistency. Some monks argued that a man could sin just by having an erection, even if he never acted on it. Others said nocturnal emissions were involuntary and thus okay, unless they came from sinful dreams, in which case, time to fast on bread and water for a week. It gets even more tangled when you consider contraception. Medieval Europe didn't have pills, obviously, but they did have various herbal mixtures, barrier methods, and folk remedies. These were widely used, especially by women who didn't want 12 children or more, but the Church labelled any effort to prevent conception as heretical. Not just sinful, heretical, and yet midwives still whispered recipes, merchants still sold sponges soaked in vinegar, and women still tried to control their own reproduction. So, how were these laws enforced? Well, very unevenly. Rich folks could often escape consequences by paying a fine or making a hefty donation. A noble caught in adultery might have to sponsor a new chapel or monastery. Problem solved. A poor farmer's daughter caught in the same act? She might end up barefoot in the public square holding a candle and weeping while the entire village watched. One law, two realities. This didn't just apply to adultery. Homosexual acts, masturbation, even overly affectionate cuddling could trigger legal or ecclesiastical consequences, but only if someone cared enough to report you. And often they didn't, unless they had a grudge. Scholars still debate what the Church actually believed versus what the people believed. Was this about controlling desire or just controlling people? Some argue the Church truly saw sexuality as spiritually dangerous, a primal force that needed rigid boundaries. Others think it was just a convenient way to keep the masses in line and guilt-ridden, easier to rule. The truth is probably somewhere in between, part spiritual terror, part bureaucratic control, and part complete lack of understanding about human nature. And here's the wild, often forgotten fringe fact. Some of the same clerics who wrote these condemnations also wrote deeply erotic poetry and love songs in Latin. Yep. There are entire collections of medieval Goliardic verse, written by scholars and monks that celebrate wine, women and song in language so racy it'd make your grandmother's eyebrows shoot off her face. They were writing this stuff in the same centuries they were outlawing pleasure. Double lives, much. So as you walk home past the stone wall of the church, you realise that the rules themselves were a labyrinth. And maybe, just maybe, that was the point. If everyone's guilty, then everyone's controllable. You clutch your cloak tighter around you, not because of the wind, but because of how easy it is to feel condemned even when you've done nothing wrong. Tonight, the candle in your room flickers a little more wildly. You hear a fox scream in the woods. You close your eyes, hoping the dream doesn't come back. But somewhere deep inside, a part of you knows it will, and that maybe you want it to. You wake before the bell rings, heart thudding from some dream you can't quite remember, but leaves a slick of guilt in your chest anyway. You pull on your tunic and head out into the dawn mist, the village just beginning to groan awake. The cows are lowing, someone's already got a fire going. You see smoke curling from the chimney of the parish house where the priest lives, and you wonder, has he ever had to confess? That question sticks with you because today, Father Richard is delivering his favourite sermon again, The 7 Sins of the Flesh. He loves that one. He rattles them off with dramatic flair, voice rising like he's performing in a medieval talent show. Lust, gluttony, pride, and so on. But when he gets to lust, he slows down, really milks it, looks around the pews, makes eye contact. And you notice he always glances a little longer at certain people. The stonemason's teenage daughter, the blacksmith's wife, and yeah, even you, like he's daring your soul to twitch. After Mass, a line forms at the confessional. It always does, because people sin constantly, especially when the definitions are this precise, this elaborate, this impossible to avoid. Which brings us to tonight's descent into the deep, dark rabbit hole of sin on the books. You might think we've already covered the basics, but trust me, we haven't even scraped the bottom of the parchment yet. So you're a priest in the 12th century. You've been handed a worn, greasy little leather manual, let's say the Penitentiale Theodori, or its close cousin, the Libri Penitentiales. This is your guide for confession. Not the warm, tell me your feelings kind of confession. No, this is a checklist, a ledger. Every sin has a corresponding penalty, years of fasting, pilgrimages, flagellation, or abstinence from the Eucharist. And oh, the sins. The lists are extensive, obsessively detailed, and honestly weirdly fascinated with what people are doing under their bedsheets. The very act of confession forces people to say out loud the things they weren't even supposed to think, which makes these books not just spiritual tools, but accidental erotic catalogues of medieval behaviour. Let's look at a few real entries. One question asks, "Have you lain with your spouse outside the marriage bed?" Yes, apparently even changing locations was enough to raise theological eyebrows. Another, "Have you taken pleasure in the act?" That one comes with a recommended penance of 3 years of fasting and prayer. Or this gem, "Did you climax outside the woman?" That's 6 years, no Eucharist, and possibly a stern lecture about wasting seed. Some manuals ask even more specific things. "Did you copulate while the woman was menstruating?" That was a big no-no. Another, "Did you take any herbs to prevent pregnancy?" That gets you a combo sin, lust and sorcery. Double points, double shame, and these weren't just theoretical. Priests read them aloud. Confessors asked these questions to real people face to face. That meant a 14-year-old girl who kissed the shepherd boy behind the bakehouse might find herself on her knees before a man in robes, being asked if he touched her breast and whether her heart fluttered. Imagine how terrifying that must have been. The books also categorise sins by type: solitary, mutual, animalistic, ritualised, and demonic. Masturbation, for example, was considered a serious offence, even if you were unmarried, even if it was a moment of weakness. Some monks believed it invited demons, others thought it weakened the soul's connection to God. Either way, it was a frequent confession, and penances could go on for months. One truly strange category of sin, laughter during intercourse. Yes, that was a punishable offence, not because it was disrespectful, but because laughter suggested pleasure. Enjoying the act too much was already a sin. Laughing was a sure sign that you'd lost spiritual control. What's more, some clerics argued that laughter could shake the soul from the moment of grace. Picture that. A god so delicate he's offended by giggles. And here's something even more fringe. There are recorded cases of priests asking couples about the sequence of acts during sex. Did the man climax first? Was the woman overcome by her passion? Was the act disordered? In one confession manual, there's a warning against allowing the woman to be above the man, which aside from being a theological no-no, was said to reverse the natural order and invoke demonic chaos. Seriously, they believed sex positions could summon evil. But remember, these weren't just religious opinions, these were rules with consequences. People followed them, or tried to, or failed to, and then lived with the guilt. Entire villages operated on this shared, unspoken understanding that everyone was sinning all the time, and that confession was like a reset button. Not so much a spiritual awakening as a maintenance ritual. Sin, confess, forgive, repeat. Except not everyone confessed. Some people stopped going. Some avoided the priest's eye. Some paid fines instead of performing penances. Some left town. And some just lied. What would you do if the only thing standing between you and salvation was the ability to describe your deepest urges to a man with bad breath and a handwritten list? Even among the clergy, there were quiet debates. Some monks believed the sin lists were too long, too harsh, too human. Others thought they weren't strict enough. The big theological question wasn't just, is this a sin, but what makes it sinful? Was it intention, pleasure, the act itself? Scholars argued in Latin, in letters, in smoky monastery studies where the candle wax dripped onto their robes while they debated whether thinking about breasts was as bad as touching one. The whole thing starts to feel like a trap, one where the rules are vague but the penalties are sharp, where the system is designed not to help you avoid sin, but to make sure you always feel guilty. And if you don't feel guilty, well, that's a sign you're sinning even more. So you watch the people file out of confession, their faces pale, some teary, others strangely relieved. They clutch their rosaries and mutter penances. You know half of them will be back next week, some tonight. And no one talks about what they actually said. Confession is like a ghost. You don't name it, but it haunts the village anyway. By evening you're back at home, staring at the wood grain of your table, wondering if it's safer not to think at all. But thoughts creep in. They always do. And the books? The books are still there, inked by monks who might have known more about desire than they ever admitted. You hear it before you see it. The creak of the wooden confessional door swinging on its iron hinge like it knows too many secrets. Someone slips inside. You don't recognise the back of their cloak, but that doesn't matter. Everyone eventually takes their turn. The air in the chapel smells like melted tallow, damp stone, and the faintest trace of something sour, maybe old incense, maybe fear. You stand in the shadows pretending to study a cracked fresco of St. Sebastian, but really you're listening. Everyone listens. Because this is the part of village life no one talks about, but everyone watches, the parade of shame, one whispered sin at a time. The confessional booth isn't just where people purge guilt. It's where the medieval world secretly keeps score. Who's been impure, who's in disgrace, who suddenly starts showing up to morning mass more often than usual. And the priests, they know everything, or at least they think they do. They've got their manuals, their questions, their practiced coughs and head tilts, and some of them, they get very into the details. That's what we're diving into tonight. The shadowy, awkward, strangely bureaucratic world of confession booth whispers. And how. For better or worse, the church became an unwitting archivist of every possible way people were trying and failing to follow its rules. Let's get something straight first. Confession wasn't always required. In the early Middle Ages, it was a more private affair, often done directly to God in your prayers. But by the 13th century, it was formalised, mandatory once a year, thanks to the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. That's when the church basically said, "All right, sinners, line up. We want receipts." From that point on, everyone over the age of reason, about 7 years old, yikes, was required to confess annually at minimum. More often if you were particularly naughty, which statistically speaking was everyone. Now imagine what that meant in practice. You're a woman of 35, married, 4 kids. You've had impure thoughts. You touched yourself. You're not even sure why. You just did. Now you have to describe that to Father Bernard, who once tripped during Easter Mass and knocked over the baptismal font. He leans in and asks, with all the authority of a man who's never had sex and thinks desire is a demon from the Alps, "Did you feel warmth in the loins?" This isn't exaggeration. Confessors were instructed to ask questions about bodily sensations, movements, frequency. Some confession guides even instructed priests to clarify whether the sinner felt delight in the act. If they said yes, more years of penance. If they said no, still a sin, just not as juicy. And it wasn't just about your own body. Spouses were expected to report each other. If your husband was too rough, or your wife too eager, you could mention it. It was all fair game. A married couple could both confess the same act, but from opposite angles. He says she seduced him. She says he pressured her. Now the priest gets to decide who's lying. Or maybe he doesn't care. Maybe he just mutters a prayer, assigns a penance, and forgets. But maybe he remembers. Because here's the creepy twist. Some priests were less like therapists and more like collectors. They memorized things. They formed opinions. Some even wrote stuff down. There are recorded examples of priests who took notes. Not for spiritual reasons, but because they were compiling evidence of patterns of sin in their villages. It starts sounding less like salvation, and more like surveillance. There were even cases of confessors becoming obsessed. A notorious 14th century French priest was investigated after multiple women reported that he kept asking for more detail, especially when it came to sexual sins. He claimed it was necessary to determine proper penance. The bishop didn't buy it, and while he wasn't excommunicated, he was quietly reassigned, far away. Let's not pretend the penitent had all the power either. There was enormous pressure to self-incriminate. If your neighbour went to confession and you didn't, people noticed. It might mean you were hiding something. The act of confessing became both spiritual obligation and public signal, proof that you were still in the fold, still scared of hell, still playing by the rules. And yet, here's the beautiful ironic part. While the confessional was meant to crush sin, it accidentally preserved it. All those manuals, all those sin lists, they are now one of the richest sources we have for understanding medieval sexual behaviour. Because nobody wrote diaries. Peasants didn't publish tell-all memoirs, but they did confess and priests recorded patterns. And from those patterns, historians have reconstructed a whole hidden world of medieval intimacy. A world where newlyweds often didn't wait for a church wedding. Where men and women experimented, sometimes tenderly, sometimes clumsily. With touch, with pleasure, with everything the church said would doom their souls. Where teenagers fumbled behind barns. and soldiers visited brothels before marching off to war. A world where people were human, despite everything. There's an especially quirky debate among historians about the reliability of these confessions. Were people exaggerating out of guilt, or underplaying to avoid punishment? Some scholars argue that most confessions were more performance than truth, a kind of social ritual where you said what you were expected to say. Others believe the opposite, that in a world with few outlets for honesty, confession was the one place people let it all spill out. Maybe it was both. Maybe you told 90% of the truth and left out the part that made you cry. Or maybe you confessed a fantasy you never acted on, just to see what the priest would say. Either way, the result is the same, an archive of whispered shame and forbidden longing. And there's another layer. The church needed people to confess, because confession kept people loyal. It reinforced guilt, and guilt drove obedience. But it also created a strange intimacy between priest and penitent. Imagine having to describe your deepest urges to the same man who blesses your child's baptism, who eats at your table during Lent, who gave a whole sermon last week about lust being the root of damnation. It's a bizarre kind of spiritual vulnerability. Sacred, maybe. But uncomfortable? Oh yes. You pass the confessional again after dusk. The chapel is quiet now, empty. But the booth still looms in the corner like a lurking thought. You wonder what it would feel like to go inside and tell the truth. The real truth. Not the safe version. Not the memorized list. Just the aching, stupid, deeply embarrassing truth of being alive in this body, in this time, in this church, trying to feel loved while being told you're always wrong. And maybe that's what everyone else is doing too. The bell tower groans out the Angelus at noon, a low, slow reminder to stop what you're doing, bow your head, and pretend you haven't been thinking about that thing you did, or almost did, last night. You drop your eyes and mumble the prayer like everyone else in the muddy village square, but your thoughts are 1,000 miles away, specifically about the priest, not because he's preaching anything new. No, it's because you've seen him disappear into the woods with that travelling weaver girl twice this week. And both times he came back looking flushed, his sash askew, his hair sweaty, and you're not the only one who noticed. So tonight, we're peeling back the polished surface of clerical celibacy and digging into the messy, very human, very hypocritical truth. Priests were not so pure, not by a long shot. Let's start with the official story. By the 12th century, the church had drawn a firm, shiny line in the sand. All clergy, especially those in holy orders, were to remain celibate. No sex, no marriage, no hand-holding under the communion table. The Second Lateran Council of 1139 made it crystal clear. Any marriages priests had entered into were considered null and void. Celibacy wasn't just encouraged, it was mandatory. An outward sign of inner purity, a way to separate the holy from the profane. But here's the dirty little secret. Very few priests actually obeyed. It wasn't a quiet rebellion either. It was systemic. Across Europe, records show that large numbers of parish priests had mistresses, kept unofficial wives, and even had children. Lots of children. In some villages, it was an open secret. You'd walk by the rectory and see the housekeeper nursing a baby that looked suspiciously like the local priest. In towns, there were entire neighbourhoods where these unofficial priest families lived, like a forgotten suburb of forbidden love. And the church knew. Oh, they definitely knew. But enforcement was uneven and often politically motivated. A wealthy bishop might get away with sleeping with his choir boy and face no consequences. Meanwhile, a poor country priest caught cohabiting with a woman might be fined, relocated, or, if his bishop was feeling righteous, excommunicated. But even then, the punishments weren't always enforced. Sometimes the church just looked the other way, especially if the priest was good at collecting tithes and keeping parishioners in line. In fact, there's a famous term from the period, concubinage. That's how chroniclers describe the widespread practice of priests living with women as though they were married. Not in secret, not always in shame, sometimes just as part of village life. A 14th century German bishop even described entire dioceses, where nearly every priest kept a concubine, and not in the shadows either, some were listed on tax records. Now here's a fun fringe fact. Because these relationships were unofficial, the church found a clever way to profit. In some regions, priests were charged an annual concubinage fee. Yep, you could literally pay to keep your mistress. The The church got its money and the priest got to keep his bed warm. Everyone wins except for the whole vow of chastity thing. But let's talk about the women. These weren't all one-night flings. Some were lifelong partnerships, even if they couldn't be called marriages. Others were coercive, transactional, or worse. Priests wielded immense power, and not all used it gently. There are documented cases of women being pressured into sexual relationships with their confessors under threat of damnation or social ruin. It's one of the ugliest corners of medieval religious life, the abuse of spiritual authority for personal gratification. And while not all priests behaved this way, enough did to make it a persistent problem. The papacy tried to crack down. Pope Gregory VII launched a massive reform campaign in the 11th century, targeting simony, buying of church offices, and clerical marriage. But despite all his thunderous decrees, the practice of concubinage persisted. Why? Because enforcing celibacy was like herding particularly horny cats through a firelit monastery. The ideal was divine, the reality was deeply human. And here's where it gets even more uncomfortable. Some of the very priests writing about sin in their confession manuals were also the ones breaking the rules. Imagine a man spending his mornings hearing confessions about lust, and then spending his evenings rolling around with his cook in the vestry. That dissonance, that complete disconnect between public holiness and private behaviour, was baked into the structure. Scholars still argue about whether this widespread disobedience undermined the Church's moral authority. Some say it absolutely did, that lay people saw the hypocrisy and began to question everything. Others argue the opposite, that people expected it, that the priest's fallibility made him more relatable. After all, if even he couldn't resist, maybe there was hope for everyone else. The medieval mindset wasn't always about perfection. It was about knowing your place in a world shaped by sin. And yet, some priests truly tried. There are stories of holy men who resisted temptation with heartbreaking sincerity, fasting, flogging themselves, sleeping on stone floors to rid themselves of impure thoughts. One famous monk, Peter Damian, was so disgusted by the lust he saw in his fellow clergy that he wrote passionate treatises denouncing their behaviour. He was ignored mostly. Then there's the case of St. Ulrich of Augsburg, who openly said that married priests were better than hypocritical ones, because at least they weren't lying. That quote got him some dirty looks from Rome, and let's not forget the monastery scandals. In some abbeys, entire networks of secret relationships blossomed behind closed cloisters. In one particularly juicy case in 15th century France, an abbess and half the nuns under her supervision were found to be hosting regular visits from local monks. No one was surprised. Everyone was scandalised. The bishop fined the entire convent and quietly retired. But despite it all, the hypocrisy, the scandal, the lust dressed up as ritual, the structure remained. Priests still heard confessions, still gave sermons on purity, still punished others for sins they themselves committed. The system wasn't about consistency, it was about control. And you watch Father Richard climb the chapel steps, robes billowing, face composed. You know about the weaver girl. You've seen the way he avoids your eyes. And for a brief moment a wicked little thought bubbles up. Maybe you'll confess something made up just to see how red he turns. You don't, of course. You're still scared, still unsure. But the thought lingers. Because if the man who holds the keys to heaven is breaking his own rules, maybe the gates aren't as locked as they want you to believe. The first time you're invited to the convent, it's under very official circumstances. Sister Agnes has taken ill and they need someone to fetch herbs from the woods. You're quick on your feet, good with plants, and most importantly, you're not nosy. Or so they think. You've never actually been behind the convent walls before. Most villagers haven't. From the outside, it's all clean whitewash and crisp lattice windows, the kind of place that looks too holy to touch. But the inside, that's something else entirely. You step past the heavy oak doors and find yourself in a courtyard shaded with pear trees, where nuns glide quietly between tasks, some tending a garden, others mending robes, one casually beating a rug like it just insulted the Virgin Mary. There's no chaos, no obvious scandal, just the low hum of work and a strange underlying calm. And yet, you can't shake the feeling that there's more happening here than prayer and embroidery, something warm, secret and soft in all the wrong places. Tonight, we're pulling back the veil, literally and metaphorically, on the world of nuns and the locked doors. Because while the Church tried hard to cast convents as fortresses of chastity, silence and devotion, the real story, as usual, is a lot more complicated. Let's start with the rules. A nun's life was supposed to be cloistered, cut off from the world to protect her from temptation and vice. She took solemn vows of chastity, poverty and obedience. She wore a habit to erase vanity. Her days were ruled by prayer bells, her nights by silence and sleep. Contact with men, absolutely forbidden, except for confessors and bishops, and sometimes carpenters. Okay, so the loophole started early, but cloisters weren't exactly prisons. Sure, they had high walls and locked gates, but they weren't airtight. Letters passed in, messages passed out, pilgrims visited, nobles dropped by with donations, and stayed for dinner. Some convents doubled as hospitals or schools for noble girls, and those guests weren't always shy. There were back passages and servants who talked, and sometimes the women behind the walls decided that vows weren't stronger than curiosity, or loneliness, or love. You probably think, well, maybe a few rebellious nuns broke the rules now and then. Try entire networks. In medieval France, a 14th century investigation into a Benedictine convent found that several sisters had maintained long-term romantic relationships with men from the neighbouring town. The nuns had even worked out a schedule, certain nights of the week, specific gardens and corridors, keys that unlocked doors not meant to be opened. When the bishop found out, he was scandalised. The punishment? Temporary house arrest and a lot of prayer, and then life resumed, quietly. But it wasn't always about men. Here's the historical truth most medieval chroniclers ignored, or deliberately erased. Some of these women were in love with each other. There are letters, real ones, that survive centuries, warm, longing, filled with coded language and endearments. One nun wrote to another, calling her my soul's twin, and begging her not to be sent to another convent. The phrasing is flowery, sure, it's the Middle Ages, everyone sounds like a poet, but the intent is unmistakable. This wasn't just friendship. Modern scholars still argue about how widespread queer relationships were in convents. Some say they were rare and isolated. Others argue they were common, just never spoken of openly. After all, when you lock dozens of women together for life, deny them marriage, and encourage emotional intimacy through prayer, something's bound to happen. It's not hard to imagine two novices kneeling side by side in the chapel, hands brushing, prayers whispered into shared breath. And the Church? Officially, any such relationship would have been condemned as unnatural, sinful and punishable by exile or worse. But unofficially, it was often ignored, especially if it didn't threaten male authority. The great medieval sin wasn't always what you did, but who found out? Then there are the weirder stories. Like the nun in 15th century Germany who snuck out of her convent dressed as a man and lived for years as a travelling musician before being caught. Or the abbess in northern Italy who amassed enough power and wealth that she basically ran her convent like a tiny queendom, complete with political alliances and shady financial deals. She had visitors, men from noble families who stayed long after nightfall. She claimed they came to discuss land rights. Sure they did. One fringe fact. In some rare cases, pregnant nuns weren't expelled. They were quietly sent to other convents, where the child was either adopted out or raised in secret. The Vatican archives contain a few letters, dry, Latin-heavy correspondences, casually arranging for the relocation of Sister Clara and her infant, as if that's just another Tuesday in cloister life. But not all stories are about rule-breaking. Some are about resistance. Not every girl who entered a convent did so willingly. Many were given to the Church as children, part of a dowry negotiation or family shame. Once inside, escape was nearly impossible. Those who tried were branded runaways, sometimes even excommunicated. The convent was safety for some, but a cage for others, and yet within those walls the women built rich lives. They wrote music, copied books, painted icons, composed prayers that still echo in cathedral vaults today. Some became respected scholars. Some performed minor surgeries. Some managed vast estates better than any local baron. These weren't passive prisoners. They were women navigating a narrow, rigid world and finding ways to stretch the seams. You watch Sister Beatrice carry a basket of pears from the orchard, her face flushed, her veil pushed back just enough to show her windblown hair. She catches you watching and smiles just once, then looks away. There's something in that moment. Not flirtation, but a flicker of understanding. You've both been trained to hide things. You both know that rules don't change desire. They only push it underground. As you leave the convent, a bell rings for evening prayers. The sound is soft, nearly drowned out by the crickets and rustling leaves. Behind the gates, voices rise in chant, pure, harmonized, holy. And somewhere in those voices, hidden between the syllables of Latin and the rise and fall of tone, is the simple, unholy truth. No one in this world is entirely what they pretend to be. You're at a wedding. The whole village is. Half the people here don't even know the couple, but that's not the point. Weddings are one of the few events where peasants and nobles, clergy and commoners can all gather in one muddy courtyard and pretend, for a few hours, that life isn't held together by plague, taxes, and the constant fear of hellfire. There's music, cheap ale, roasted pigeon, and some poor guy trying to keep a goat from eating the bride's veil. But what everyone's really here for, what the kids whisper about and the elders pretend not to smirk over, is what happens after the feast. The bedding ceremony. Ah yes, the bedding ceremony. That glorious moment when the solemn sacrament of marriage collides head first with the chaotic energy of a rowdy sleepover, a public roast, and a soft-core ritual, all rolled into one. Tonight, you get to see it up close. And no, it's not subtle. Let's set the stage. The ceremony has just wrapped up. The priest mumbled his way through the Latin. The groom nearly dropped the ring. The bride tried not to cry. Now everyone's drunk and the sun's down, which means it's time for the community to march the newlyweds to bed. Yes, march, with torches, songs, and, in some cases, instruments designed to imitate bodily functions. You've never heard a bagpipe played this obnoxiously, and honestly, it's impressive. The newlyweds are escorted, sometimes half carried, into a bedroom that's been prepared in advance. The bed is fresh stuffed with straw, clean linens, candles lit, and then, depending on local custom, the crowd either politely exits or stays to watch. That's right. In many parts of medieval Europe, especially among the nobility, it was customary for witnesses, sometimes the couple's parents, sometimes entire wedding parties, to literally stay in the room while the marriage was consummated. Some nobles sat at the foot of the bed, joking and toasting. Others just waited outside, straining to hear movement. A few really committed communities even demanded proof. The bloodied sheet held up the next morning, a grotesque little trophy of presumed virginity. You're probably thinking, there's no way people were cool with this, and you'd be right. Some were horrified. There are accounts of brides fleeing, fainting, or locking themselves in closets to avoid the spectacle. Others submitted in silence. Some found quiet ways to resist, smuggling in blood-stained cloth ahead of time, faking fatigue, bribing a maid to block the door. But the pressure was enormous, especially for women. The moment of consummation didn't just mark the beginning of a marriage. It was legal proof that the union was valid. No consummation, no marriage. And sometimes that meant no dowry. For noble families especially, this was a transaction, and that first night was the receipt. But even among commoners, bedding rituals had teeth. In some villages, if a woman was found not to be a virgin, her family could be fined or shamed. If a man failed to perform, he might be dragged to a priest and asked very specific questions about his capabilities. There are court records where villagers testified about hearing or not hearing the sounds of sex through thin walls. Seriously, whole lawsuits hinged on this stuff, and if the marriage wasn't consummated, it could be annulled. No divorce necessary, just a declaration that the couple had never actually become one flesh. Which leads us to one of the weirdest recurring roles in medieval village life, the expert witness of penetration. That's not a joke. In certain cases, especially involving noblemen, midwives, physicians, and even priests were called in to examine the bride, or worse, the groom, to determine if everything had occurred according to nature. There's a famous case in 14th century France where a bishop questioned a groom's former lovers under oath to determine if he had a history of performance. You can imagine how uncomfortable that got. But bedding ceremonies weren't all horror and humiliation. In some regions, especially among lower classes, they were more playful. Raucous, yes, but with a sort of communal joy. Friends would serenade the couple. Women would tease the bride, offering helpful advice while stuffing her bed with flowers or slippery herbs. Men would roast the groom about stamina and honour, and whether he'd last longer than the wedding speeches. The idea was you weren't going into marriage alone. The whole village had your back, whether you wanted it or not. One particularly quirky tradition. In some parts of Scandinavia, they'd actually race the bride and groom to the bed. Whoever got there first got to lead in the marriage. This turned the entire thing into a slightly tipsy foot race in heavy clothing. Romance, medieval style. Now, scholars love to debate just how widespread and invasive these bedding ceremonies were. Some argue that the more extreme versions, like actual witnesses in the room, were limited to aristocratic courts. Others say versions of it trickled down into rural villages, adapted to local customs. But everyone agrees, the line between public and private was very thin. You didn't just marry your partner, you married your community's expectations, and your body, especially if you were a woman, wasn't entirely yours anymore. Which brings us to the emotional fallout. Imagine being a 14-year-old girl, because yes, many medieval brides were that young, dragged into a loud, bright room, stripped by giggling matrons, and laid beside a man you barely know while half your cousins loiter in the hallway. The trauma of that night could echo for years, and while not all weddings were like that, some were tender, some couples were in love, it's easy to see how the ceremony, in its worst forms, became a form of socially sanctioned violation. And yet, for all its horror, the bedding ceremony also reveals something fascinating: how deeply communities feared secrecy when it came to sex. Marriage wasn't just a contract between two people, it was a legal, spiritual and social event that had to be witnessed, proven, and validated. There was no room for quiet, private intimacy, not at first anyway. That came later, if it came at all. You leave the wedding early, the cheers fading behind you. The groom looked pale, the bride looked stiff. You wonder if they'll find joy in each other once the torches go out and the laughter fades. Or if they'll just do what everyone else does. Learn to endure. Somewhere behind you, someone lifts a mug and shouts, "To the bride's honour!" The crowd roars. You walk faster. You wake to the sound of laundry snapping in the wind and something clattering down the village street. A runaway chicken, or maybe just a runaway child. Either way, the world moves on. But in the small hut next to yours, things are not so normal. The new bride, the one from last night's wedding, is already in tears. Not quiet sobbing, not even controlled weeping. Full, shaking, breathless crying. Her mother is there, talking too quickly. The midwife stands in the doorway, lips tight. You don't ask what happened. You already know. This morning the bedsheets were supposed to be displayed. Tonight we're stepping into the brutal, humiliating and sometimes downright absurd world of virginity tests and dowry drama. Because in medieval Europe, a woman's worth was calculated with frightening precision, and nowhere was that more obvious than in what she bled or didn't on her wedding night. Let's start with the basics. Virginity was currency. If you were a woman, your social value, your marriageability and your family's honour were all wrapped around the thin membrane of your hymen, a part of the body that even medieval doctors didn't really understand but were absolutely obsessed with. In noble circles, proving that a bride was intact wasn't just tradition, it was legal necessity. Land, titles, and inheritances were at stake. Among commoners, it could be the difference between respect and ruin. So what did they do? Well, they made a spectacle out of it. After the bedding ceremony, someone, usually a mother or close female relative, would collect the bedsheets, carefully examine them, and then either present them publicly or whisper the verdict to the rest of the family. No blood. That was a problem. The absence of blood was often taken as proof that the bride was not a virgin. Cue the chaos. Of course, this practice was rooted in several faulty assumptions, chief among them being that all virgin women bled during intercourse. Modern science tells us that's not necessarily true. But medieval people didn't have Google. They had a dangerous mix of folklore, religious dogma and utter guesswork. If the bride didn't bleed, her life could unravel in minutes. The groom might refuse to accept the marriage. He could drag her to court for fraud. He could demand the dowry be returned, or worse, keep the dowry and annul the union. There are records of marriages dissolved the very next day over this exact issue. In some towns, a woman's entire family could be fined or dishonoured. One particularly grim case from 13th century Italy involved a bride whose dowry was seized, her father publicly whipped for deception, and the girl sent back to her family in disgrace. And the bride, well, Let's just say her options were limited. Sometimes she was forced to prove her innocence through invasive physical inspections conducted by midwives, who weren't always gentle or unbiased. In more severe cases, she might be accused of fornication, forced to confess under threat of spiritual punishment, or paraded through the streets as damaged goods. There's one account of a girl who was made to stand barefoot in the churchyard holding a candle, while villagers hurled insults at her. Her crime. Deceptive modesty, which probably just meant not bleeding enough. But let's not pretend this was only about blood. Underneath it all was a fierce anxiety about female autonomy. The virginity obsession was never really about biology. It was about control. If a woman had experience, if she chose to love someone before her arranged marriage, she was seen as wild, dangerous, ungovernable. Virginity wasn't proof of innocence, it was proof of obedience. And that's what the church and society both demanded. Now, enter the dowry. The other half of the equation. Dowries were serious business. They weren't just gifts, they were legal contracts, economic exchanges meant to secure alliances, settle debts, or raise a family's status. A noblewoman's dowry might include land, livestock, and servants. A peasant girl's could be a cow, some cloth, or a few silver coins. But in either case, if her virginity was in doubt, the dowry became unstable. It could be halved, retracted, or fought over for years in court. One quirky twist? Some wealthier families had their own virginity insurance policies. They'd prepare a small bag of animal blood or dye, discreetly placed between the bride's legs during the wedding night to stain the sheets. It wasn't foolproof, but it bought time. Other brides were coached to scratch their inner thighs during intercourse to simulate blood. There were manuals passed down from midwives to mothers, full of these little tricks, proof that not everyone bought into the illusion, even if they had to play along. And some women didn't play at all. Take the case of Joan of Leeds, a 14th century English nun who faked her death to escape the convent and elope with a man. When discovered, she was declared a vessel of carnal lust, and forced back into religious life. Her punishment wasn't just about running away, it was about rejecting the role assigned to her. Virgin, wife or nun. Pick a box, stay in it. Joan kicked the whole thing over. Scholars still debate how seriously virginity was enforced across regions. Some argue it mattered more in aristocratic circles than among peasants. Others say rural communities were just as harsh, sometimes even more so because reputation mattered deeply in small closed villages. But either way, the system left little room for nuance. A girl in love, a victim of assault, a wife with a fragile hymen, all treated the same once the sheet came up clean. And where was the groom in all this? Usually nowhere near the scrutiny. A man could arrive at the altar with a trail of former lovers and still be applauded as experienced. If he couldn't consummate the marriage, it might become a scandal, but it usually didn't destroy his life. The double standard was blatant, cruel, and embedded into every legal, religious, and social structure of the time. Back in your village, the bride is still crying. You hear her mother whispering urgently, offering comfort or excuses or maybe just the best lie she can think of. The midwife closes the door quietly and you walk away. Not because you don't care, but because there's nothing you can do. This is how the world works. Blood means virtue, silence means survival, and tomorrow, when you see her at the well, she'll pretend everything's fine. She'll smile a little too tightly, and no one will say a word. Because pretending is how people keep moving. At least until the next wedding. You hear them before you see them, a rattle of laughter, footsteps over gravel, and the familiar squeak of the pillory's hinges. Another soul being led to the square. This one's young, a farmhand, probably 17, shirt torn, cheeks red from more than just embarrassment. Behind him, a woman follows, trying not to meet anyone's gaze, her hair hastily covered with a stained kerchief. Someone in the crowd spits. Another shouts, "Shame!" That's the cue. The tomatoes start flying. Today's public punishment isn't for theft or heresy. It's for fornication. Unmarried, uncovered, unapproved, caught in the act. No plague of boils, no fiery sermon needed. Just the simple fact that they did what nearly everyone does, and got caught. Tonight, we're stepping into the loud, messy world of public shaming games, where sin wasn't just punished, it was performed. Because in medieval towns and villages, discipline was rarely private. And when it came to sexual missteps, the consequences were designed to humiliate, correct, and most importantly, entertain. Let's talk about the stock first. You've probably seen it in old woodcuts. Wooden beams clamping a person's neck and wrists, leaving them locked in a crouch while the village walked past. The goal wasn't physical pain, it was exposure. You were put on display for a set number of hours or even days, depending on the severity of your offence. And if your sin was of a sexual nature, premarital sex, adultery, prostitution, or anything vaguely lewd, you could expect some creative additions. Sometimes offenders were forced to wear signs detailing their crime, lusted after a married man, or lay with another's wife. Sometimes they were dressed in absurd costumes. A man found guilty of adultery might be forced into a woman's tunic and paraded through the streets. A woman might have her head shaved, her clothes torn, her feet bare in the mud. The point wasn't rehabilitation, it was spectacle, and people loved a spectacle. One especially theatrical punishment was the charivari, a chaotic, noisy procession used to mock those who violated sexual norms. Originally used to shame men who married too young, too old, or too submissively, it quickly became a catch-all for any scandal. Picture it, villagers banging pots, playing rude tunes on homemade instruments, and marching through town like some twisted parade. If the target was a cuckolded husband or a sexually deviant couple, the crowd might carry an effigy of the offenders, stuffed dolls with exaggerated features, while yelling crude rhymes. The noise was the point, the louder the better. This wasn't justice served cold, it was punishment as party, humiliation as community bonding, and once you'd been through it, your reputation might never recover. But not all shaming rituals were that loud. Some were chilling in their quiet cruelty. In one tradition, a woman caught in adultery might be forced to attend mass on her knees, crawling up the aisle with a candle in her hands, everyone watching, everyone judging. In another, offenders had to stand barefoot outside the church for days, exposed to the weather, while their sins were read aloud each morning. The only mercy? Sometimes their names were omitted, but that didn't stop anyone from guessing. And let's not forget riding the stang. This was a punishment used mainly in Northern Europe. If a man was suspected of beating his wife, or if a couple's sexual conduct offended the village norms, he might be lifted onto a pole and paraded through the streets backwards, while the townsfolk shouted insults and mimed his alleged crimes. In some versions, women were forced to ride too, mocked for seduction, looseness, or even just talking back. Now here's a truly bizarre fringe fact. In some French and English towns, pigs were also subjected to public punishment for sins of the flesh. No, really. If a pig attacked a child or was caught in an improper act, it could be tried in court, dressed in human clothes, and executed publicly. One record even shows a pig being flogged for indecent conduct. Not quite the same as adultery, but you get the vibe. Moral panic didn't stop at humans, so where did these rituals come from? Some were tied to church law, others to local custom. But the heart of it was this: sexual behaviour was never just personal, it was social property. Your choices reflected not just on you, but on your family, your neighbours, your entire community. So when someone broke the rules, or was even rumoured to, they weren't just punished, they were made an example. And let's be real, the system was wildly uneven. A nobleman could seduce a dozen women and walk free. A peasant girl who flirted with a married man might find herself locked in a pillory, with her shift soaked in ale. Men got away with it more often, women bore the brunt of the shame, and if you were poor, forget mercy altogether. Scholars still argue whether these shaming rituals actually worked. Did they stop people from sinning, or just teach them to hide it better? Some think the ceremonies served more as performance than deterrent, a pressure valve for communal frustration, a way to keep the moral panic in check. Others say it reinforced social order with terrifying efficiency. After all, if you knew what happened to the last girl caught sneaking into the mill house, would you take the risk? But here's the hidden truth. Beneath all the shouting and pointing and giddy cruelty, most people watching had probably broken the same rules. They'd kissed someone they shouldn't, touched someone in secret, dreamed of someone not their spouse. Public shaming wasn't just punishment, it was a way to feel clean by comparison. You stand at the edge of the square, watching the boy in the pillory flinch as a cabbage hits him square in the jaw. He's humiliated, yes, but you can tell he's also furious. And the girl, she's silent now. Her mother hovers near the stocks, gripping her arm like she might vanish. When the sun starts to dip, the priest comes out and makes a show of releasing them. There's no apology, no absolution, just dismissal. As they walk away, the crowd begins to scatter, voices shifting back to everyday concerns, grain prices, bad teeth, the coming frost. The show is over. But the story? That lingers. Tomorrow someone will retell it. Louder, cruder, probably with extra details. By the end of the week, it'll be a new village myth. And by the time the next couple is caught, no one will even remember their names. It's a feast night at the manor, and you've managed to sneak in through the kitchens with the other hangers-on. The Lord is celebrating something. Maybe a new hunting dog, maybe a new tax loophole. But the result is the same. Meat, music, and more wine than the cellar can justify. A servant hands you a half-eaten pigeon leg. The great hall flickers with firelight. And over in the far corner, under a crooked tapestry of St. George, stabbing a dragon in a particularly sensitive area, the lord of the manor is whispering into the ear of a woman who is definitely not his wife. Tonight's topic, noblemen's night games, or how the upper crust managed to do all the same forbidden things as everyone else, just with more money, more protection, and occasionally more poetry. Let's start with the unspoken rule. If you were powerful, the rules did not apply, at least not in the same way. While peasants were being locked in stocks for fornication, or crawling to mass with candles of shame, noblemen were discreetly paying off abbots, marrying mistresses to retainers, or sending a problematic lover on a pilgrimage to somewhere far away. Sex scandals among the elite were not rare. They were normal, expected even, just inconvenient when they went public. One of the most common transgressions, bedding the help. If you were a nobleman, your estate was full of vulnerable people, chambermaids, kitchen girls, wet nurses, even serfs who worked the land. These women were often poor, unmarried, and legally invisible. Consent in this context becomes a slippery thing. Could a maid truly say no to a man who owned her father's farmland? Probably not. And even if she did, no one would believe her. If she got pregnant, it was either quietly taken care of, or, more often, she was cast out. Sometimes with a few coins and a warning not to make trouble. Sometimes, though, these affairs evolved into long-term arrangements. Mistresses were kept in separate homes, provided with servants and given allowances. Their children, known as bastards, a term the church coined with icy finality, might even be acknowledged, especially if the nobleman had no legitimate heirs. A few bastards rose to prominence in their own right, leading armies or inheriting wealth after some legal gymnastics, but most simply vanished into the background of medieval life, half-legitimate ghosts, born from noble beds and erased by noble reputations. And what about noble women? Were they saints while their husbands strayed? Hardly. But their risks were much higher. A noble woman caught in an affair risked everything: her lands, her titles, her life. Some managed it anyway, often through elaborate secrecy and coded letters. In one infamous case, a countess kept her lover hidden inside the castle walls for years, disguised as a mute servant. He later wrote an entire book of love poems about her, most of which were ignored by scholars until someone noticed how many were written in blood. But for noblemen, especially kings, sex was part of politics. Marriages were arranged for power, love was outsourced, affairs were expected. Take King Edward III of England, who fathered several illegitimate children, including with his long-term mistress Alice Perrers. She was criticised for her influence at court, but not for the affair itself. That part was just background noise. In France, King Charles VI's court was a hotbed of rumours. Alleged trysts between courtiers, secret marriages, and nighttime escapades that occasionally ended in duels. One chronicler referred to the court as a garden of forbidden flowers, which is a poetic way of saying everyone's sleeping with everyone and pretending it's for diplomacy. Even the church sometimes got pulled into the mess. Noblemen who were particularly pious, or just careful, would arrange for their lovers to be relocated to convents. Not as nuns, mind you, but as protected guests. A nobleman might fund a chapel in return for the abbess's silence, or he might marry his lover off to a loyal retainer and keep visiting her in secret. Problem solved. Nothing to see here. Move along. Of course, not all lords were subtle. Some flaunted their behaviour openly. One particularly arrogant duke in Burgundy reportedly had a separate ledger for his mistress's expenses, marked under ornamental upkeep. Another wrote letters to the Pope, asking if a certain affair could be forgiven in advance, as the lady is of great beauty and I am, regrettably, weak. The Pope declined to comment, but even noblemen occasionally paid the price. If the affair caused too much scandal, especially if it involved someone else's wife or someone politically sensitive, it could spiral. There are stories of duels, forced marriages, land seizures, even quiet assassinations meant to clean up a nobleman's reputation. The higher the status, the harder the fall if things got messy. And here's the strange twist. Despite all this hypocrisy, noblemen were often the loudest voices in support of chastity laws, moral campaigns, and harsh punishments for commoners. They built churches, sponsored sermons, and paid monks to write treatises about purity. It was a way to launder their image. Do as I say, not as I do, wasn't just an attitude, it was official policy. Historians still argue whether noble sex scandals damaged the church's credibility. Some say it was just accepted as part of aristocratic life, like war or gout. Others argue that the obvious double standard helped sow the seeds of early dissent. When a bishop's son is drinking with your village priest's mistress, how seriously can you take a sermon about sin? Fringe fact. In some Italian city-states, there were so many noble bastards that entire tax brackets were created for them. No joke. You had your legitimate line, your acknowledged but baseborn, and your unrecognised. It was a bureaucracy of lust. You leave the feast as the torches start to sputter and the wine flows freer than sense. The nobleman is now laughing loudly, his hand resting on the thigh of a new girl, a kitchen maid maybe. She's smiling, but her eyes aren't. You know that look. It's the look of someone doing mental math. How long can I stay before someone notices? Before the rumours start? Before the silence gets too heavy to lift? You walk back through the moonlit woods, your boots squelching in soft mud. Somewhere behind you, the music fades into a kind of hush, the kind that comes right before something is broken. The courtroom isn't what you expect. It's not grand or echoing with judgment. It's a dim little chamber in the back of the town hall, smelling faintly of mould and too many feet. The magistrate is slouched in a wooden chair that creaks every time he leans forward, and the scribe beside him is already half asleep, his quill drooping. But the woman standing in front of them isn't drooping at all. Her back is straight, her chin up, her face red, not from shame, but from rage. She's been accused of adultery, and she is not having it. Tonight, we open the brittle pages of lust in the law books, where the real meat of the medieval sex debate got sorted, or fumbled, by local courts. Because while the church roared about eternal damnation and purity of the soul, the local courts had to figure out what to actually do with people caught in carnal situations. And surprise, there were laws, lots of them, and they were often contradictory, weirdly specific, or just plain bonkers. Let's begin with the legal framework. In medieval Europe, two systems often overlapped: canon law, church law, and civil law, secular, usually enforced by local lords or town councils. If you sinned, you might end up answering to either one or both, depending on who was mad at you. Adultery, that could be a moral offence handled by the church and a legal one handled by the town. Caught soliciting a prostitute, pay a fine to the town bailiff, then fast for 40 days under the priest's supervision. Double jeopardy? Never heard of her. Now, what exactly counted as a sex crime? Here's the short list. Fornication, sex outside of marriage, adultery, sodomy, which covered a broad range of non-procreative acts, incest, prostitution, and in some places, even wanton gazes or flirtatious speech. Yes, flirting could get you fined. One court record from 14th century York documents a man penalised for excessive winking and suggestive singing. The scribe helpfully noted that his song included ungodly refrains. But when it came to enforcement, things got murky. Local courts weren't always interested in moral purity. They were interested in order. If your affair caused a scene, led to a fight, resulted in an unwanted pregnancy, or, God forbid, involved someone of high status, you were in trouble. But if you kept it quiet, well, maybe you'd just get a warning. The most common punishment: fines, a tidy little payment to the court chest, scaled according to your social rank and how juicy the offence was. Rich people could afford their way out of almost anything. Poor folks got creative. A week of public penance, a walk through the square barefoot, or being made to confess in front of the whole parish. Women usually got hit harder, especially if pregnancy was involved. It was hard to deny when there was a belly as evidence. In one jaw-dropping case from Cologne in the late 1200s, a woman was accused of sleeping with her neighbour's husband. Her punishment? She had to carry a live goose around the village green for an entire market day, shouting, "I have sinned, but I carry no shame." The goose was later roasted for the town bailiff's lunch. The woman's reputation never recovered. But the court didn't always believe the accuser. False accusations happened, sometimes out of jealousy, sometimes as revenge, and in some rare cases the court sided with the accused, like the noblewoman in Aquitaine who argued that she couldn't have committed adultery with the stable boy because, quote, "he had the face of a boiled turnip." She was acquitted. The stable boy fled town. One especially strange case involved a married couple suing each other simultaneously. He claimed she was barren and unfaithful. She claimed he was impotent and cursed. The court ruled that they had to attempt intercourse in front of witnesses, a not uncommon legal solution to prove consummation or capability. Luckily, or unluckily, neither could perform under pressure, and the marriage was annulled. Here's where things get more complex. Same-sex relationships. The church condemned them outright under the umbrella term sodomy, but civil courts were inconsistent. Some cities, especially in Italy, turned a blind eye unless there was scandal. Others issued fines, exile, or even execution, but these were rarer than you might think. There's a scholarly debate over just how often sodomites were prosecuted versus how often they were simply ignored, especially if they were discreet, wealthy, or connected. One fringe fact. In medieval London, several court records show male prostitutes being fined, not for their profession, but for working in the wrong neighbourhood. It wasn't about morality, it was about zoning. The city didn't care what you did behind closed doors, as long as you didn't do it near a church or a merchant guild hall. Talk about mixed signals. There were also morals police of a kind, lay people tasked with reporting indecency. In England, they were called jurors of the leet court. In parts of France, they were known as denouncers. These people were often the most nosy, most gossip-addicted residents you can imagine. They kept tabs on who was sneaking into whose cottage, and were only too happy to testify about who had been seen leaving whose bedchamber at sunrise. Not always accurate, but always dramatic. And of course, not all trials led to punishment. Sometimes the accused were simply shamed into silence. Sometimes the witnesses disappeared. Sometimes the magistrate was in on the secret. And in at least one case in Bologna, the entire record of a sex trial was mysteriously burned after it turned out that the judge himself was involved. So where does all this leave you, sitting in the back of that courtroom, watching the woman on trial refuse to bow her head? She doesn't deny the affair. She doesn't sob or plead. She just says, "If my husband had kissed me half as well, I wouldn't have looked elsewhere." The scribe perks up. The magistrate coughs and scribbles something. You suspect he'll be retelling this moment over ale tonight. The sentence is issued. A fine, a week of prayer, and no public banishment. A light punishment. You wonder if it's because she's convincing, or because half the men in the room have their own secrets tucked behind locked doors and polished boots. Outside, the rain starts to fall. The accused walks away without waiting for permission. Her head is still high. And you're left wondering not whether justice was served, but what justice even means in a world where sin is common, shame is currency, and the only thing separating a scandal from a sermon is how well you lie. The building is painted a colour that's technically red, but more like the sticky shade of overripe cherries crushed underfoot. It leans slightly to the left, as if it's too tired to stand straight anymore. A wooden sign swings above the door, carved with a discreet symbol, a half-open rose or maybe a crown, depending on how much you've had to drink. No name, no address, but everyone knows what it is. This is the brothel, legal, licensed, and in full bloom. Tonight, we slip past the swinging doors and into the perfumed world of brothels by royal charter, a chapter in history where sex work wasn't just tolerated, it was taxed, organised, and sometimes even blessed by the king himself. Let's get one thing out of the way. Prostitution in medieval Europe was everywhere. Every major city had brothels. Most market towns did too. They existed across class lines and national borders, and while the church huffed and puffed about sin, Governments, especially city councils and monarchs, tended to take a more practical view. If men were going to seek pleasure, better they do it in a controlled environment where someone could profit from it. Enter the licensed brothel, a curious hybrid of vice and bureaucracy. Cities like London, Paris, Florence and Vienna had designated red light districts centuries before the term even existed. In London, it was Southwark, just across the river from the more pious core of the city. Brothels there operated under royal permission, granted through charters that gave the owner certain rights, as long as they followed a list of rules. What kinds of rules, you ask? Well, for starters, no soliciting outside the premises, no working on holy days, no violence against clients, unless they asked probably, and crucially, no nuns. That rule had to be added after a few too many incidents involving disguised sisters found living in houses of ill repute. The brothels were expected to pay taxes, sometimes directly to the crown, sometimes to the local bishop or mayor. This income was no small sum. In some cities, revenue from brothels helped fund public projects, roads, bridges, even church repairs. Imagine the irony of a cathedral roof restored by the wages of sin. And people knew. It wasn't a secret. The system functioned because everyone pretended to be shocked, and then looked the other way. Inside the brothels, life was a mixed bag. Some were well run, with clean rooms, regular meals, and a sense of hierarchy among the women. Others were filthy, dangerous, and barely a step above slavery. Women entered the trade for all kinds of reasons: poverty, coercion, escape from worse options like abusive marriages or famine. A few chose it freely, drawn by the promise of independence and, in some cases, higher pay than they'd ever see as a maid or washerwoman. There was even a sort of career ladder. Some prostitutes worked their way up to madams, running their own establishments. Others became courtesans, cultivating wealthy clients, and engaging in conversation, music, and politics as much as sex. In Venice and Florence, courtesans were known for their wit and education. Some even wrote poetry or advised politicians. But for most women, the work was hard, the hours long, and the risks high. One particularly odd quirk of the system: in many towns, sex workers were required to wear distinct clothing, not to protect them, but to mark them. In Florence, they wore yellow veils. In some parts of England, striped hoods. This was less about hygiene and more about hierarchy, making sure everyone knew who was pure and who wasn't. Because even though brothels were legal, the women inside them were still treated as morally inferior, useful but tainted. And the church? It walked a strange, twitchy line. Officially, prostitution was sinful, but theologians like St. Thomas Aquinas argued that it was a necessary evil, better than chaos, better than rape, better than men defiling virgins. Remove prostitutes from the world, he wrote, and you will fill it with sodomy. Not exactly a glowing endorsement, but it kept the system going. Some bishops even took a direct hand in managing brothels. In 15th century Vienna, the local church oversaw several houses, ensuring the women were regularly examined by physicians and that taxes were paid on time. Confessors were dispatched on rotation. You could confess your sins in the brothel, though naturally not while in the act. Boundaries. But of course, not everyone followed the rules. Illegal brothels popped up constantly, often offering cheaper services or specialising in things the licensed houses couldn't. Some worked out of bathhouses, which doubled as spa and sex parlour. Others operated under the guise of dancing schools or fortune-telling. And some noblemen simply kept their own private brothels on estates, no licence required. And then there was the sex trade's darker edge: trafficking, coercion and abuse. Young girls kidnapped or sold by their families, foreign women trapped in strange cities. In some cases, even widows were forced into brothels to settle debts. These women had no protection, no choice, and no legal recourse. The charter system helped a few, but it didn't stop the suffering underneath. Still, the brothels endured, and so did their contradictions. Cities would shut them down during outbreaks of plague or Lent, only to reopen them quietly weeks later. Priests condemned them from the pulpit while sneaking in after dark. Public officials paid for their silence with public funds. The whole thing functioned not because it made sense, but because it allowed society to keep its dirty secrets wrapped in clean parchment. One especially telling court record from 14th century Paris involves a brothel owner suing a nobleman for non-payment. She argued that her girls had performed services in good faith and without injury, and that he owed for their time and their silence. The judge ruled in her favour, the nobleman grumbled and paid. And here's your fringe fact for the night. In some German towns, virgin prostitutes were advertised at higher rates and protected by law, for exactly one night. After that, no more protection. The law recognised their first service as a kind of legal and moral turning point, after which all bets were off. You pass the brothel again on your way home. A red light flickers behind one window, laughter echoes down the alley, low, tired, not joyful but not miserable either. Someone's sweeping the front step, the same girl you saw there last week. She nods at you, once, like a shopkeeper acknowledging a regular. And just like that, you remember what the church never quite managed to stamp out. People will always need touch, not because they're weak, not because they're sinful, but because being alone is sometimes harder than being damned. You notice it first in the quiet spaces. An extra monk wandering the village paths at dusk, a sacristan who lingers too long outside homes where a young widow lives alone, a boy from the choir who always seems to appear when lovers are stealing kisses behind the grain store. They don't say much, these watchers, but they see everything, and they report it. Not because they're particularly pious, although some are, but because they've been told to. They're part of a larger, stranger machine, built not to spread grace, but to monitor bedrooms. Welcome to the world of monastic spies and bed checks, where sex wasn't just a sin, it was a suspected activity, one the church tried to police with a mixture of divine authority and very earthly surveillance. Tonight, you're stepping into the back hallways, secret chambers, and midnight inspections that reveal just how deep the obsession with sexual control went in the medieval period. It all starts with canon law again, that great sprawling system of moral codes that covered everything from murder to meat consumption. But when it came to sex, especially illicit sex, enforcement was tricky. Most sins happened in private, and the church, for all its fire and brimstone preaching, didn't trust people to police themselves, so they built a network. Not a formal spy agency, don't picture black robes and secret passwords, but a scattered system of informants, visitors, and enforcers whose job was to keep an eye on bodies and beds. One of the most invasive examples, the episcopal visitation. Bishops or their appointed agents would visit monasteries, convents, and parishes to inspect moral conduct. This wasn't just about counting candles or checking prayer schedules. These officials would ask about sexual behaviour, who was sleeping where, whether anyone had been seen sneaking around, whether the local priest was really living alone or just pretending. In some convents they performed literal bed checks. They walked the halls at night, opening doors to ensure every nun was present and in her assigned cell. If that sounds creepy, congratulations, you're still capable of critical thought. But in the medieval mindset, this wasn't about voyeurism. It was about order. Temptation was thought to be ever-present, always lurking, and women, especially unmarried or religious women, were considered especially vulnerable to it. Any deviation, an empty bed, a missing monk, a suspicious stain, could spark an investigation. Some monasteries appointed internal morality officers. These were usually older members, respected, grey-haired, probably insufferable, who were responsible for monitoring the behaviour of younger novices. They watched for excessive closeness between monks. They listened for whispered conversations. In one particularly strict Cistercian abbey, brothers were forbidden from speaking in pairs unless a third party was present. That rule was specifically designed to prevent intimate relationships from forming. It was a kind of holy cockblock enforced in the name of salvation, and it wasn't just within monasteries. In cities, the church appointed chastity inspectors, yes, really, who were supposed to track down cases of cohabitation, prostitution, and other public scandals. In some towns, these inspectors could enter homes without warning if they had sufficient suspicion of immorality. What counted as suspicion? A closed door, a muffled laugh, a candle still burning after curfew? It didn't take much. There are records of these raids. In Paris, a woman was found sharing a bed with her cousin. She claimed it was for warmth. Totally innocent. The inspector disagreed, citing excessive proximity and inappropriate leg orientation. No, we're not making this up. The case made it all the way to a bishop who eventually ruled that no sin had occurred, but only after the woman agreed to spend a month attending extra masses. Her cousin was fined and told to sleep with greater modesty. Now for one of the weirdest fringe practices, interior confessionals built into walls where confessors could listen to not just spoken sins, but noises. In some extreme cases, mostly imagined by overly zealous reformers, there were rumours of listening holes between guest quarters in monasteries and adjacent buildings, allowing monks to detect signs of sexual misconduct. While these may have been rare or even apocryphal, the fact that they were even discussed tells you a lot about the cultural anxiety at the time. But here's the contradiction. For all this obsession with surveillance, the church still didn't have the manpower or the consistency to enforce morality evenly. Most villages were too remote, most bishops were too distracted, and many officials quietly ignored minor indiscretions unless they caused scandal. That meant the system functioned less as a net and more as a sword, swinging down suddenly, selectively, and usually when someone wanted power over someone else. The result? A culture of watching. People watched each other constantly, not out of piety, but out of fear. A neighbour might report you for spending the night in the wrong cottage. A servant might whisper your secrets to the priest. Even within families, parents were told to monitor their children's modesty, and husbands were encouraged to supervise their wives' social habits. It was medieval panopticon, an early version of social surveillance dressed up in sacraments and scripture. And it made people paranoid. There are letters, written in cramped Latin or awkward vernacular, where people ask their confessors if they've been seen holding hands too long, or standing too near someone. Entire communities became so trained to see sin that they imagined it everywhere. A girl blushes too easily. She's impure. A boy avoids eye contact with the priest. He must be hiding something. Guilt became collective. Suspicion was virtue. And of course, like all systems built on control, it was abused. Monks with political ambitions used surveillance to ruin rivals. Priests punished women they disliked by accusing them of lewd conduct. Nobles manipulated church agents to disgrace enemies. In some cases, people were excommunicated for suggested behaviour, things they may or may not have even done. But the deepest irony, while the church obsessed over physical purity, it created the very conditions that fostered secrecy, deceit, and shame. People didn't become better, they became better at hiding. Back in your village, you hear footsteps outside your window late at night, a soft creak, a pause, then silence. Maybe it's a dog, maybe it's a watcher. You hold your breath, stare at the dark ceiling, and feel the familiar weight of being observed, even when alone. You remember the old proverb the midwife once muttered, "The devil walks among us, but the priest watches from the trees." You don't sleep for a while after that. There's a letter tucked beneath the candle stub on your table, folded carefully, sealed with wax that's already cracking. You don't need to open it to know who it's from. You recognise the loop of the S in your name, the faint trace of perfume pressed into the parchment, the way it hums with risk just from being in your room. You've read it 5 times already. 6, if you count the time you pretended not to. The words are simple, the meaning is not. Because in this world, saying I miss you isn't innocent. Not when it comes sealed and written by the wrong person, delivered by the wrong hand, and sent with the kind of care reserved for crimes. Tonight, we're slipping into the hushed and heartbeat-fast world of forbidden love letters. Those fluttering pages that manage to travel across monasteries, between cloisters, through castle walls, and even under the noses of confessors. In an age where touching someone could condemn your soul, writing to them became the one loophole too sweet and too dangerous to resist. Let's start with the obvious. People weren't stupid. They knew the rules. The church had laid them out in excruciating detail. Physical contact, sinful. Lustful thought, sinful. Whispering romantic words to someone not your spouse, also sinful. So what did people do? They wrote. Letter writing in the medieval period was more than just communication. It was intimacy made ink. The very act of sitting down with a piece of parchment, choosing your words, sealing it with wax or ribbon, it was both method and metaphor. It allowed people to reach beyond their roles: nun, priest, wife, scribe, servant. You weren't supposed to be in love with your confessor. You weren't supposed to want the boy training to be a monk. But if you could put it on paper, if you could make it sound like poetry or prayer or allegory, then maybe, just maybe, you could get away with it. One of the most famous cases, the letters of Héloïse and Abélard, a 12th century philosopher priest and his brilliant student who fell wildly in love against all laws and logic. Their affair led to pregnancy, secret marriage, and eventually castration. Yes, that happened. But their letters endured. In them, Héloïse doesn't just whisper longing. She shouts it. She questions the church, questions love, questions her own soul. And Abélard? He swings between guilt and passion like a man being pulled in half. Their words, preserved over centuries, still sting like fresh wounds. But they weren't alone. Across medieval Europe there are fragments of other letters, some anonymous, some attached to scandals, some hidden in court archives like pressed flowers that somehow survived the fire. A servant writes to a lady above his station, comparing her hair to the Virgin's veil. A novice nun writes to another, calling her the light in my darkness, the voice in my silence. A scribe sends riddles to the baker's son, each answer a clue to where they'll meet next. These weren't just acts of rebellion. They were lifelines, quiet acts of survival in a world that treated longing like treason. And here's the clever bit. Many letters were written in code, not secret language, but spiritual language. Love disguised as devotion, lust cloaked in Latin quotations. I long to kneel at your altar doesn't sound so bad, unless you've also written it beneath a sketch of a bed. Some lovers use biblical metaphors, referencing the Song of Songs or the Book of Ruth. Where you go, I will go. It sounds holy. It is holy, but also it's not, and they knew that. Delivery was its own kind of art. Letters were tucked into hymnals, slipped between loaves of bread, hidden in books returned to monastic libraries. Servants were bribed, children were tricked into playing messenger. In some cases, lovers used objects as code. A white feather left in a doorway, a sprig of rosemary on a windowsill, a coin scratched with initials. Each signal meant something, and once received it burned hotter than any sermon. Of course, letters weren't without risk. If intercepted, they could lead to excommunication, imprisonment, or worse. In 14th century Spain, a monk caught exchanging letters with a nun was sentenced to a year of silence, daily lashings, and transfer to a distant monastery with no window-facing cells. His letters were burned. Hers were copied into a confession manual as examples of what not to write. Yes, really. But even when discovered, many letters were admired for their beauty. Scholars and priests, even while condemning them, would remark on the skillful prose, the metaphor, the artistry. The church was always torn. Punish the sin, yes, but acknowledge the craft. After all, the same church taught you to write, taught you to read, taught you to quote scripture and compose verse. What did they think was going to happen? There's a fringe fact that always makes people pause. Some monasteries had love letter graveyards. Not official ones, but hiding places where monks would bury the letters they couldn't bear to destroy, inside old walls, under floorboards, behind icons. These caches have turned up during restorations, yellowed parchment with melted wax seals, some still scented, some marked only with initials. No names, just traces of lives that almost were. And let's not forget the nobles. Courtly love was practically a genre. Knights wrote to ladies wrote to each other. Poems were passed around courts like gossip, each one disguised enough to avoid scandal, but juicy enough to get the point across. Entire romances were composed as letters. Fake or real, no one's quite sure. Some scholars argue these were purely literary exercises. Others swear they're confessions wrapped in fiction. So what did the church say about all this ink-stained subversion? Unsurprisingly, it didn't approve. Love letters were classified under suggestive communication, a sin of both speech and intent. Priests warned against wandering eyes and wandering pens. Confessors were trained to ask about private writings, and still the letters flowed. Because no amount of guilt, no length of penance could smother the need to say, I want you, I see you, I remember you. You hold the letter again now. You read the line that always makes your stomach twist. If the stars had mouths, they'd speak your name when I look up. It's ridiculous, over the top, and it hits you harder every time, because in a world that breaks your body for touching, a letter lets your soul lean forward and almost kiss. You fold it back carefully. The wax has crumbled, but the words are intact. You don't burn it, not tonight, because there are some sins worth repeating. You hear the word whispered before you see the man they're saying it about. Sodomite. It rolls off the tongue like a curse and a joke at the same time. Half spit, half smirk. The old brewer leans over to the blacksmith and mutters it with the kind of relish reserved for gossip. Too dangerous to say outright and too juicy to keep in. A boy nearby hears it and snickers. No one looks directly at the accused man, but no one turns away either. He walks through the village square like a ghost wearing human skin, shoulders tight, face unreadable. He knows what they're saying, he just doesn't know who said it first. Tonight, we crack open the most avoided and yet widely misunderstood chapter in this tangled history, Sodomy and the scapegoat. Because while the medieval church had strong opinions about same-sex behaviour, enforcement was a different matter entirely. This is a story not just of persecution, but of selective memory, of laws with teeth that only bit when convenient, and of people who lived in the margins hoping no one looked too closely. First, some context. In medieval usage, sodomy wasn't limited to what you might think. It was a catch-all term used by church and legal authorities to cover a wide array of non-procreative sexual acts. Male-male, female-female, oral sex of any kind, even heterosexual acts that weren't considered natural. The term itself came from the biblical city of Sodom, which, depending on your interpretation, was destroyed either for sexual deviance, lack of hospitality, or just being a total disaster of a neighbourhood. The church, predictably, picked the first option and ran with it. By the 13th century, canon law explicitly criminalised sodomy, lumping it alongside bestiality and incest. It was, in theory, a mortal sin and, in some regions, a capital crime. Civil authorities began to follow suit. In parts of Italy and France, sodomy could be punished by exile, branding, or even burning. In England, the crime was officially recognised in secular law by the early 1500s, but church courts had been dealing with it long before that. And yet, actual prosecutions were rare, not because it didn't happen, but because proving it was nearly impossible. Most same-sex relationships were private, quiet, coded. Two men walking side by side wasn't enough. Two women sharing a home wasn't unusual, especially among widows. Even when rumours surfaced, authorities often lacked witnesses, let alone physical evidence. The result? Most accusations fizzled out or were quietly buried, or, if the accused was wealthy or useful, they were simply ignored. But when charges did stick, they were devastating. The punishment wasn't just physical, it was reputational. To be branded a sodomite wasn't just to be a sinner, it was to be untrustworthy, unmanly, a danger to the social fabric, and since the label was so broad, it was often used politically. Disgrace a rival by questioning his purity, ruin a cleric by suggesting unnatural acts. In this sense, sodomy became the perfect scapegoat crime, impossible to disprove, deliciously scandalous, and socially lethal. One infamous case? In Florence during the 14th century, authorities created the Office of the Knight, a literal bureaucracy for prosecuting sodomy. Over several decades, it issued thousands of indictments, and yet, the vast majority were dismissed, reduced, or ended with small fines. Why? Because most of the accused were young, from good families, or just discreet enough to skate by. The system wasn't designed to stop sodomy, it was designed to control it, politically, financially, and socially. And sometimes the double standard was laughable. Noblemen could indulge quietly, with their squires, pages, or household staff. If discovered, they might pay a fine, go on pilgrimage, and return to their estates. Meanwhile, a poor boy caught in the same act could be beaten, branded, or hanged. The same crime, different outcomes, as always. But let's step away from punishment and ask the harder question. What was it actually like to live this way? To feel desire you couldn't name, let alone express? To love someone in secret? To hide affection behind borrowed words and carefully timed glances? We catch glimpses of these lives in the margins, literally. In the margins of manuscripts, monks sometimes doodled images of men embracing or kissing. In troubadour poetry, same-sex longing appears in veiled stanzas. In court documents, you find strange little phrases, shared his bread too often, or was seen lingering in the orchard, that hint at something deeper. There are letters between women, full of tenderness and longing, though the Church almost never acknowledged female same-sex love as real, much less sinful. In fact, some theologians insisted women couldn't sin in that way because they lacked the necessary parts. The old no sword, no sin loophole. Of course, some people couldn't or wouldn't hide. There are records of medieval people living openly, even flamboyantly by the standards of the time. Some were tolerated, even admired. One man in 14th century Germany was known in his village for dressing in women's clothes, dancing and making bawdy jokes. He was eventually brought before a church court and acquitted. Why? The community loved him. They thought he was funny. And crucially, he wasn't rich or powerful enough to be worth targeting. He was safe scandal, but not everyone was so lucky. The most brutal cases tended to happen when same-sex behaviour became a symbol of rebellion. In heresy trials, for example, sodomy was often thrown into the mix, not necessarily because it happened, but because it painted the accused as completely corrupt. The Templars were accused of it, so were the Cathars, so were countless others, often with little evidence. Once again, sodomy became shorthand for all that was wrong with your enemies. Here's your fringe fact. Some medieval thinkers believed that sodomy was transmitted like a disease, through touch, through gaze, through influence. That's why schools and monasteries got so twitchy about inappropriate closeness. They feared it could spread, like lusty leprosy. And yet, through all this fear, desire didn't stop. People still found each other, still took risks, still wrote poems that no one read until centuries later, still carved hearts into stone walls with initials no one could quite explain. History remembers the fire and the laws and the trials, but somewhere out there, behind the barn in the orchard, in the shadows of the cloister, someone was whispering, "I love you," in a language the church never quite managed to unteach. You walk past the accused man again as the crowd thins. He doesn't look at you. You don't look at him. But you want to. You want to say something, anything that says "I know." But silence is safer, and tonight, safety wins, even if it shouldn't. You're reading by candlelight, hunched over a borrowed manuscript, the kind copied by a monk with either poor eyesight or a mischievous sense of humour. At first glance, it's what you expected, a bestiary, full of descriptions of animals both real and imagined. But as you flip the pages, it becomes increasingly clear. This isn't just zoology. This is moral instruction, and it's deeply weird. Here's a lion that represents Christ, a unicorn that only lies its head in a virgin's lap, and then, halfway down a page, a note about goats, specifically that goats symbolise lust because they stink of desire and copulate with great enthusiasm. Right. Tonight, we dive into the slippery, hoof-print-covered realm of bestiaries and beastly warnings, that odd corner of medieval thought where animals were more than just animals. They were symbols, scapegoats, and occasionally cautionary tales for everything humans weren't supposed to do, but often did anyway. So, let's start with the medieval bestiary itself, a kind of field guide for the spiritually terrified. These books weren't just catalogues of animals, they were allegories, pairing real and not-so-real creatures with moral lessons. A pelican feeding its young with blood from its own breast. That's Jesus. An elephant forgetting how to stand and needing a virgin to help it rise. That's the church and, well, honestly, no one's quite sure. But the point is, every animal meant something, and many of them were used to warn against sexual sin. Take the goat, poor doomed goat. Medieval people hated goats, not because they were bad livestock, but because they were seen as hairy little sex monsters. Bestiaries claimed goats had insatiable lust and preferred high places so they could look upon the sun while mating. Yes, they were accused of enjoying the view during intercourse. You'd be hard-pressed to find an animal more slandered for its libido. Then there's the monkey, equally condemned for its supposed connection to unbridled sexuality. Monkeys were said to mimic human behaviour in perverse ways. There are even illuminations, full colour, of monkeys groping each other or peeking up skirts. Some monks insisted these images weren't for entertainment, but for education. If people saw how low lust could drag you, literally to animal behaviour, they might resist temptation. Probably didn't work, but sure. Snakes? Obviously lustful. Because they're phallic, slither through secret places and are linked to Eve and the fall of man. Easy target. But also, according to one bizarre 13th century bestiary, snakes can only reproduce through the mouth. Don't ask how that works. No one knew then either. The explanation? A warning against filthy speech. Somehow. You also get the weasel, which was believed to conceive through the ear and give birth through the mouth. This anatomical impossibility was used to warn women not to hear unclean words, lest they become spiritually corrupted. Again, the metaphor is somehow grosser than the lie itself. Of course, this wasn't just about animals. The Church used animal behaviour as a framework to define and condemn human behaviour. If you acted like a lustful creature, you were sliding down the moral food chain. That was the fear. Humans had souls, animals didn't. So if your passions made you act like a goat, a dog, a monkey, or, God help you, a cat, you were in danger of losing what made you human. And yes, cats had a moment too. In some circles, cats, especially black ones, were associated with female sexuality and witchcraft. Because they were independent, mysterious, and too agile to pin down, women who kept too many cats were sometimes accused of having dark companionship, and not the cuddly kind. But perhaps the most infamous animal allegory tied to sex, the barnyard rooster. It was believed that a rooster's crow symbolised vigilance, unless he crowed at the wrong time. Then he was considered a sign of premature arousal. There's an actual theological argument recorded in a 12th century manuscript about whether a crowing cock could be blamed for a monk's impure dreams. You cannot make this up. And then you've got the griffin. Now griffins were majestic, half eagle, half lion, and used as symbols of strength. But in one obscure German bestiary, the griffin is described as wild with desire and given to unnatural pairings. The implication? Even mythical beasts aren't above sin. The takeaway? No one is safe. Not even the creatures that don't exist. So why all this animal slander? Because the medieval church understood something very simple. People don't always respond to logic, but they do respond to fear, and to images. Animal metaphors were powerful. A sermon about resisting temptation might go over a few heads. But a picture of a goat mounting another goat under the disappointed gaze of an angel? That sticks. Even outside bestiaries, animal metaphors were common. A man with an appetite for prostitutes might be described as a rutting boar. A woman who spoke too freely about sex might be called serpent-tongued. Men who couldn't control themselves were bull-headed, while women who seduced were fox-hearted. It was folk psychology meets Sunday school with a strong dose of barnyard insult. Here's a truly fringe fact. Some monks claimed that certain sins made you resemble animals in the afterlife. Lust, you'd become goat-like. Greed, a pig. Pride, a peacock. One particularly creative manuscript features images of naked humans with donkey ears, dogtails, and frog legs, all suffering in hell while demons roast their feet or laugh behind banners that say things like, "Now who's acting like a beast?" But despite all the warnings, all the grotesque illustrations and smudged Latin notes, the message was always the same. Don't give in to your animal nature. Be better. Be pure. Stay human. Ironically, this obsession with not being like the beasts meant that people spent a lot of time thinking about beastly things, and writing about them, and drawing them in stunning detail. Which makes you wonder, were they really trying to warn people, or just projecting their own messy thoughts onto animals? Scholars today argue over whether medieval people actually believed these metaphors, or if it was more about social control than genuine zoological concern. Some say the bestiaries were just moral entertainment, like holy comic books. Others believe they reflected a real anxiety, that humans were always just a few choices away from becoming animals. That civilization itself was a thin veneer over a swamp of temptation. You close the bestiary, hands ink-smudged, brains swimming with strange images. Outside, a goat bleats in the distance. You try not to read into it. The candle sputters. Somewhere in the text you didn't finish. A lion is lying down with a lamb, both of them watching a naked man try to climb a tree to escape a lusty mare. You decide that's enough reading for tonight. The witch isn't what you expect. She doesn't have warts, she doesn't cackle, she's not crouched over a bubbling cauldron in a thunderstorm. She's just a woman in her 50s with cracked hands, eyes like sharp glass, and a voice that carries across a market square even when she's just asking about turnips. Her real crime. She knows things. About herbs, about babies, about how to dry flowers without killing their colour. and according to half the men in town and a few whispering nuns, she once looked at someone's husband for too long, which, in a medieval village obsessed with virtue, is just one sideways glance away from Satan. Tonight we're stepping into the smoky, feverish world of witch hunts and lust confessions, a terrifying intersection where female sexuality, suspicion, and religious panic collided in spectacularly cruel ways. It wasn't just about demons or broomsticks or the devil showing up in a puff of sulphur. It was about control and fear, and more than anything else, the ancient dread of women who wanted things, especially women who wanted on their own terms. Let's go back to the roots. In early medieval Europe, belief in magic wasn't always considered heretical. Most people, yes, even monks, believed in charms, curses, and protective amulets. A wise woman in your village might make you a potion for a fever or help ease a painful birth. That wasn't necessarily suspicious. In fact, it was often welcomed. But over time, especially by the 14th and 15th centuries, the church started getting twitchy. It wasn't just magic they feared. It was magic combined with female autonomy, sexual agency, and just enough literacy to write things down. Enter the witch hunters. Not yet the full-blown Inquisition style with pointed hats and bonfires in every town square, but the early forms, inquisitors, confessors, local clergy tasked with rooting out heresy, and by extension, anything that smelled like independence wrapped in incense. And this is where it gets wild. In many of the early witch trials, women were accused not just of casting spells, but of having sex with demons. Yes, the act had a name, copulation with incubi. This wasn't symbolic. Medieval people genuinely believed that women were being seduced at night by male demons, incubi, who snuck into bedrooms, disguised themselves as lovers, and used their supernatural anatomy to corrupt human flesh. There are confession transcripts, real ones, where women describe in excruciating detail how a dark figure visited them at night, how their bodies responded, how they were helpless to resist. Some of these confessions were extracted under torture, others volunteered. That's the part that makes scholars today scratch their heads. Some women describe these encounters in ways that suggest real longing, even pleasure. Were they mentally ill, spiritually manipulated, or were they just using the language available to describe very human dreams in a deeply repressive culture? One theory? That incubus encounters were a coded expression of sexual desire, a way to confess longing without naming names. After all, saying, "I had a sinful dream about Brother Alric" gets you excommunicated, but saying, "a demon came to me in the night and tempted me with unclean passion," that earns you a penance and a place in the Book of Miracles. Of course, there were also real consequences. Women accused of witchcraft, even if no magic had occurred, were often subjected to humiliating purity tests. Midwives and clergy would examine their bodies for witches' marks, said to be proof of diabolic contact. These marks were usually just birthmarks, moles, or old scars, but in the logic of the church they were damning. In some cases, women were stripped in public and their genitals examined in full view of the community, under the guise of religious duty. It was cruelty, dressed as cleansing. And then there's the Malleus Maleficarum, a 15th century witch-hunting manual written by Heinrich Kramer, who really should have just gone to therapy. This book, which became the Witch Hunter's Bible, was obsessed with the idea that women's sexuality was inherently dangerous. Kramer argued that women were more carnal than men, more susceptible to temptation, and therefore more likely to sleep with demons, curse crops, and seduce monks with a glance. He even claimed that women were more likely to deny Christ because they were more inclined to lust. There's a whole chapter titled, "How Witches Deprive Men of Their Virile Member." No, seriously. Kramer wrote that witches could steal penises and keep them in boxes. Not metaphorically, he meant literal detachable penises. He claimed to have witnessed this. He was not well. But while the official church sometimes distanced itself from Kramer's nuttier theories, his book was widely read and used as a template for interrogations. That meant that during a witch trial, a woman could be asked not only about her beliefs or potions, but about her sex life. Had she ever experienced unnatural pleasure? Had she ever desired someone in secret? Had her body responded without permission? And here's the cruel trick. Female sexuality was both proof of sin and irresistible temptation. If you were too attractive, you were dangerous. If you were too old, you were suspicious. If you had no children, you were barren and probably bitter. If you had too many children, you were accused of luring men. It was a minefield. And every step you took echoed in a courtroom. One fringe fact that chills the blood. In some towns, confessed witches were forced to name lovers. The names would be written down, and those people could then be summoned, questioned, or punished. In one case from Bohemia, a woman under torture confessed to having been seduced by 3 village men and 2 demons. The court wrote down all 5 names. Guess which ones were flogged? The men. Guess who was burned? The woman. Yet, not every community joined the frenzy. In some places, especially where local priests had a more relaxed view of sexuality, accusations were met with skepticism. One abbot famously refused to prosecute a woman accused of demon sex, saying, "The devil has better things to do." A moment of reason in a very unreasonable time. Modern historians still debate how much of the witch panic was about sex versus power. Some argue that these trials were primarily about silencing women, especially older, independent women with no male protection. Others say it was a genuine spiritual panic, a mass hallucination about purity and temptation in an uncertain world. Either way, female desire was the target, unspoken, unexplained, and therefore terrifying. Back in your village, the old woman with the sharp eyes walks past your door. She carries a basket of herbs. Kids throw stones at her feet. Someone mutters a word they don't even understand. You look at her hands, they're steady, her chin is up. You wonder what she's dreamed of, and whether she ever dared to write it down. The messenger arrives at dusk, cloaked, wind-chapped, and acting as if he's merely delivering a prayer request or an invitation to a feast. But you recognise the seal on the scroll. It bears the papal crest, slightly worn but unmistakable, and the hush that falls over the manor confirms it. This is not a normal message. The lord of the house takes it into his study, locks the door, and doesn't emerge until the fire's gone low. No one asks what it said. They already know. The church has looked the other way. Again. Tonight, we trace the thread of silence and selective enforcement through the church's quiet exceptions, where the same moral authority that roared about sin also whispered exceptions into noble ears and closed its eyes when the right coin passed the altar rail. Because while the clergy may have preached eternal purity from the pulpit behind closed doors, they often offered something else, indulgence, especially when the sinner was important. Let's begin with the mechanism that made this all possible, indulgences. Technically, an indulgence was a reduction in the punishment due for sins after confession and absolution. You still had to repent, but certain deeds, or payments, could soften the consequences. Pilgrimage, charity, building a church, funding a monastery, or, funding someone else's sin management. Over time, indulgences became a subtle currency for managing morality, a bribe with a blessing attached. This led to a delicate dance between the papacy and the powerful. Noble families, royal courts, even whole kingdoms were granted indulgences not just for military service or donations, but for being exceptional cases. Need to annul a marriage because you're bored or politically inconvenienced? The Pope might allow it. Want to quietly legitimize your bastard son? Perhaps a fee and a favour. Need the church to ignore the fact that you fathered 7 children with your wet nurse? We can work something out. Take Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, whose family became the gold standard for church-approved debauchery. He openly acknowledged his mistress, Vanozza dei Catane, and their 4 children, including Cesare and Lucrezia, who went on to cause their own little tidal waves of scandal. Rodrigo wasn't the first pope to have a mistress, he was just bolder about it. And while Rome gossiped and sniped, most of the church hierarchy shrugged, because the Borgia family made the right appointments, paid the right tithes, and controlled enough land to make even the most pious bishop think twice. But it wasn't just about popes behaving badly. Local bishops and abbots had their own networks of leniency. Some kept lists, noble families with standing agreements, a sort of moral priority lane. If a lord committed adultery, the bishop might counsel him in private. Accept a donation to the cathedral and arrange a quiet reconciliation. If a peasant did the same, public penance, stocks, perhaps even exile. In some towns, wealthy families were granted papal dispensations allowing marriages that technically violated canon law. cousins too closely related, or remarriages without enough time between partners. The Church forbade it publicly, but the paperwork often said otherwise. One bishop in 15th century Burgundy approved a marriage between a man and his late wife's sister, citing unique familial need. That need turned out to be inheritance. Big surprise. Even clergy weren't immune to special treatment, if they had the right connections. Priests who fathered children were supposed to be defrocked, but some simply had their misdeeds recorded in a side ledger and were quietly transferred to a new parish. The Church had a word for these cases: irregularities. They weren't sins, they were problems of order, fixable, paperwork issues, like ordering the wrong number of candles. One particularly absurd fringe case: a bishop in England granted an indulgence to a knight who confessed to bedding both a noblewoman and her daughter. Instead of punishment, he was instructed to fund repairs to a local abbey and to pray for their souls. The record ends with the note: penance deemed sufficient due to social status and family's generous past support of the Church. Translation: they gave us money, so we'll call it even. Now, to be clear, not all clergy approved of this behaviour. Some wrote treatises condemning the corruption. Reformers like John Wycliffe and Jan Hus tore into the Church's hypocrisy, arguing that the institution had lost its moral authority. Even within monasteries, whispers grew louder. Why should a poor farmer confess to impure thoughts if the local bishop lived in a literal castle with 3 cooks and a rumoured mistress? But here's the uncomfortable truth. The Church's authority often depended on these quiet exceptions. The money kept things running, the influence secured political alliances, and the appearance of moral control, strict for the masses, flexible for the elite, allowed the whole system to stagger forward without collapsing. Historians still debate whether the Church truly believed in these double standards or just tolerated them for the sake of stability. Some argue that indulgences were a legitimate tool, misused by opportunists. Others say the corruption was baked into the institution from the start. Either way, the effect was the same. Morality became negotiable. This had ripple effects. Ordinary people saw the contradictions. They heard the rumours. They watched noble families thrive while their own were punished for lesser sins. And over time, this eroded trust, not just in clergy, but in the entire system of spiritual authority. You can draw a crooked, wine-stained line from these exceptions to the fires of the Reformation, when enough people finally said, "You can't sell salvation." But back in your own village, the disconnect is quieter. A nobleman walks into Mass late, his mistress trailing 2 steps behind. The priest offers them both the Eucharist. No mention of sin, no reminder of penance, just the smooth rhythm of ritual. And you? You think of your neighbour, the baker's daughter, forced to sit outside the church last week because she was caught with a boy from another parish. She cried through the whole sermon, clutching a rosary like it might let her back in. The gap is there, wide, obvious, sacred for some, scarred for others. You light a candle anyway. Because maybe grace still counts, even if fairness doesn't. The university bell tolls just after sunrise, dragging a heavy tinny ring through the fog that rolls off the city's damp cobbled streets. You're not a student, not officially, but you've been loitering around the edges of this place long enough to know how it works. Robes flap like sails as young men rush to lecture halls, parchments tucked under arms, eyes bleary from either sleepless study or something far less virtuous. And across the narrow alley from the School of Canon Law, the red shutters of a brothel creak open. Welcome to the world of university boys gone wild, the not-so-secret history of medieval student life, where the pursuit of theology and rhetoric often ran parallel to very earthly appetites. It turns out that when you gather a few thousand young men into cities away from their families, give them pocket money and bury them in Latin grammar, things get messy. Let's set the scene. By the 12th and 13th centuries, universities were springing up all over Europe. Paris, Bologna, Oxford, Padua, Salamanca. These were places of serious study, yes, but also of chaotic, testosterone-fueled freedom. Students were often as young as 13 or 14 when they arrived, and could spend years or decades pursuing their degrees. They were educated, ambitious, and very often wildly undersupervised. The Church had established strict rules for student conduct. Celibacy was encouraged, especially for those studying theology. Public drunkenness, gambling, and sexual activity were all forbidden. but enforcement, spotty at best. Theologians in training were caught in brothels. Law students got into brawls over prostitutes. Medical students wrote love poems in the margins of their anatomy texts, and nobody was particularly shocked. One of the most infamous hotbeds of academic misbehaviour, the University of Paris. It attracted thousands of students from across Europe and was notorious for its mix of brilliance and bedlam. In one 14th century complaint to the bishop, a local tavern owner described his business as overrun nightly by drunk clerks who sing lewd songs and pinch serving girls while quoting Cicero. The bishop apparently did nothing. Perhaps he'd heard the songs himself. But Paris wasn't alone. Oxford had its own debauched reputation. Students there formed gangs, known as nations, often organised by country of origin. These groups routinely clashed, sometimes violently, with townsfolk and rival students. One particularly nasty episode in 1355, known as the St. Scholastica Day riot, began when a student insulted the wine at a local tavern and ended with nearly 100 people dead over several days of street violence. Some students wore armour, others raided brothels for hostages. It took the king's intervention to settle the matter, and yes, brothels were everywhere. In many university towns, they were located deliberately close to campus. This wasn't an accident. Local authorities knew that a steady flow of students meant steady income, for landlords, tavern owners, and sex workers alike. In some cities, these student districts became economic microcosms, where booksellers and brothel keepers shared street corners and sometimes customers. Even the church turned a blind eye. In Bologna, home to one of the oldest universities in Europe, the rector of a college once petitioned the city to allow regulated brothels nearby to keep the students from pursuing women of good family. That's right. The argument was that legal prostitution would protect respectable women from student lust, and the city agreed. What makes this all more bizarre is the public performance of piety required of students. Many of these young men were technically in clerical orders. They wore robes. They attended Mass. They debated the writings of Augustine by day and tried to bribe their way into the town bathhouse by night. Some scholars even documented the psychological toll this double life took. The deep guilt, the frantic confessions, the long letters home full of lies about studying late into the night. Others, of course, had no such trouble. Here's your fringe fact of the night. There are actual medieval poems, written in Latin no less, about students catching venereal diseases. These weren't private scribbles. They were passed around, read aloud, even copied into university archives. One 13th century poem from the Camina Burana collection ends with a line roughly translated as, "He who burns with lust shall also itch and scratch and weep." A cautionary tale wrapped in rhyme. Of course, not all students were debauched. Some were deeply devout. Some spent their nights copying text by candlelight or arguing philosophy until their voices cracked. But the culture around them, the drinking halls, the bathhouses, the taverns filled with songs about lust and theology, made temptation part of the curriculum. You could graduate with a degree in law and a secret child on the other side of town. Female students? Almost non-existent. Women were excluded from university life entirely, though a few served as tutors, scribes, or patrons. The real exception came with prostitutes, who often learned to read just enough to handle bookkeeping letters, or poetry written by their favourite clients. One famed courtesan in late medieval Padua was known for reciting Virgil from memory while sipping wine on a noble's knee. She was never admitted to the university, of course, but half its faculty knew her by name. Local townspeople often resented the students, not just for their behaviour, but for their legal immunity. Students under ecclesiastical protection were often exempt from civil prosecution. That meant if a student assaulted someone, stole something, or caused public disorder, he could usually only be tried by a church court, which rarely handed down real punishments. Imagine being a baker whose daughter is groped by a philosophy major, only to be told the case must be referred to the bishop. Frustration mounted, and riots happened. The church tried to contain it. Bishops issued edicts. Rectors wrote long, disappointed letters. Some universities even imposed curfews and expelled repeat offenders. But nothing stuck for long. The flow of money, youth, and libido was just too strong. And honestly, as long as the boys passed their exams and didn't embarrass the institution too much, most authorities were willing to tolerate a little sin. Historians today view medieval universities as both cathedrals of knowledge and breeding grounds of contradiction. On one hand, they preserved the wisdom of the ancients, debated complex theology, and laid the groundwork for the modern world. On the other hand, they were loud, dirty, often violent and profoundly hypocritical, a place where you could quote Aristotle by day and hire a prostitute by night, where confession lines were long every Monday and the bathhouses never ran out of candles. You leave the university quarter just as a student stumbles out of a tavern, arm around a friend, singing a song about the Virgin Mary that, if you listen closely, has been reworded to include at least one very specific sin. A nun scowls from the alley. A priest crosses himself in the distance, but no one stops the music. It's just another night in the city of learning. The pilgrim's staff taps rhythmically against the dirt road, dust puffing with each footfall. He's wrapped in a wool cloak, scallop shell pinned to his chest, the universal badge of the devout traveller. He wears the road like a second skin, mud-caked boots, windburned cheeks, eyes that have seen too many sunrise masses and not enough beds. But the woman walking just behind him, she laughs too easily, keeps glancing sideways. And he doesn't stop her. They say they're on the road to Santiago de Compostela, but from where you're standing, they look a lot more like lovers than penitents. Tonight we step off the main road and wander into the barely whispered world of travelling lust. Pilgrims and affairs, a part of history the Church would rather we skip, and one that proves that even under holy vows, long roads and lonely hearts make a potent mix. Let's start with the basics. Pilgrimage was one of the great acts of piety in medieval Europe. From local saints' shrines to the long-haul routes to Rome, Santiago or Jerusalem, believers packed bags, kissed loved ones goodbye, and set out to cleanse their souls, honour vows or ask for divine intervention. The Church encouraged it, cities profited from it, and artists romanticised it. The image of the weary, faithful pilgrim became iconic. But beneath that halo of holiness was a very human reality. Pilgrimage wasn't just spiritual, it was also freedom. For most medieval people, life was hyperlocal. You were born, lived, worked and died within the same few square miles. Travel was rare, dangerous and heavily monitored. But pilgrimage granted you permission to move. It was a get-out-of-village free card. Suddenly, a woman could walk hundreds of miles, unchaperoned. A merchant's son could leave home for a month or a year. A priest could accompany a group of pilgrims with little scrutiny. And on that road, beyond the eyes of your neighbours and family, temptation had room to breathe. It's no coincidence that many medieval tales about pilgrimages, especially the famous literary ones, are loaded with sex. Take Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the 14th century. The pilgrims are all stereotypes, yes, but many are openly lusty. The wife of Bath brags about her lovers. The pardoner flirts. The miller tells filthy jokes. The whole thing feels less like a procession of saints and more like a medieval road trip comedy. That wasn't satire. That was realism, wrapped in rhyme. And it wasn't just in stories. Records from various pilgrimage routes suggest that sexual encounters were common. Sometimes consensual, sometimes transactional, and sometimes quietly romantic. Inns along the way weren't always safe havens of virtue. Many doubled as brothels, especially near major shrines. Pilgrimage towns like Santiago, Mont Saint-Michel and Rome became known not just for their relics, but for their red light districts. Some cities even developed a reputation for particular kinds of indulgence. In Avignon, France, where the papacy resided for part of the 14th century, brothels offered discounts to pilgrims, because technically their journey was holy, and what better way to relieve them than with a generous discount on sin? But even outside brothels, affairs bloomed. Picture it. Two strangers walking side by side for weeks, shared hardship, shared food, shared stories by the fire. Pilgrimage was emotionally intense. People confessed things on the road they'd never tell their priest. They spoke of loss, of longing, of regrets they couldn't voice at home. And sometimes those stories ended with two people sharing a bedroll in a field, under stars that had no interest in judgment. And yes, the Church knew. They knew. Sermons were preached warning pilgrims to guard their hearts as much as their purses. Pilgrimage guides, yes, those existed, sometimes included moral advice. Don't walk alone with the opposite sex, avoid touching, don't linger too long at wine stalls. Monks wrote tracts begging the faithful not to turn holy journeys into excursions of the flesh. But the more they preached, the more it became clear this was a problem they couldn't solve. There's a fringe fact that underlines the absurdity. Some church officials accused Santiago de Compostela itself of encouraging lust. Why? Because the journey was long, the towns were lively, and the miracle stories often involved healed bodies, strong legs, recovered fertility, restored vigour. It was too sensual, too inspiring. As one grumpy abbot wrote, "Pilgrims return with loins stronger than their faith." That line didn't make it into the marketing brochures. And it wasn't just lay people. Clergy went on pilgrimage too, and not always as chaperones. Some young priests joined pilgrim groups as part of their own penance. Others went for political or financial reasons. But once on the road, their collars didn't always stay stiff. Confessors were caught with fellow travellers. Monks fell in love with noblewomen. Even nuns went rogue. A scandal from 15th century Germany involved 2 Benedictine nuns who slipped away from their group and were found living with 2 male pilgrims in a nearby village, sharing everything but prayer. Their order was furious. The local bishop sent a formal apology to Rome, and yet, despite all this, pilgrimage endured. People kept walking. They still do, because beneath the layers of hypocrisy, the sexual missteps, and the moral loopholes, something real lingered. For many, pilgrimage really was transformative, not just spiritually, but personally. It cracked open their carefully boxed lives and let in something wild. Sometimes that meant prayer, sometimes it meant desire, often it meant both. Modern historians argue about how widespread pilgrimage lust really was. Some say it was overblown by church officials desperate to maintain control. Others believe the road was absolutely a pressure valve, letting people act outside their social scripts. The truth probably lives somewhere in between, enough to cause rumours, not enough to shut it down. You pass by the pilgrims again at sunset. The man's hand brushes the woman's cloak. She doesn't pull away. They're still walking toward the shrine, still counting steps, still repeating prayers. Maybe they'll confess when they arrive. Maybe they won't. But tonight, somewhere between here and the next chapel, they'll stop just off the road, lay down their burdens, and for a few stolen hours, let the sacred and the sinful hold hands in the dark. The court is quiet at first glance, serene, elegant, like something stitched into a tapestry. Silk dresses rustle as noblewomen pass in slow procession. Courtiers whisper under painted ceilings. Minstrels pluck softly at lutes. Everything looks immaculate, controlled. But then you hear it, the thump of a hidden heartbeat beneath all that velvet and lace. It's not from the throne room or the chapel. It's from the alcove near the window, where 2 gloved hands brush just a little too long. Eyes linger. A fan flutters open, then closed. A message has been delivered, one without ink, one that speaks in gesture and silence. This is the court, and this is love, dangerously draped in poetry. Tonight we're slipping into the brocade-lined maze of the erotics of courtly love, where longing was high art, passion was policy, and everyone was pretending not to notice just how much they noticed. This wasn't lust behind barn doors or passion in haylofts. This was elegance, restraint, and coded obsession, with just enough danger to make it delicious. Let's start with the basics. Courtly love was a literary and cultural ideal that emerged in 12th century southern France and quickly spread across Europe. At its core, it celebrated the romantic devotion of a knight or nobleman to a noblewoman, often someone already married, always someone socially unattainable. It was forbidden by design. That was the point. The love was meant to be spiritual, chaste and ennobling. A man who loved purely, who suffered in silence, who pined without consummation, was thought to be elevated, refined. The suffering was the virtue, the distance the power. Now, of course, that's the theory, the reality. A bit more, flesh and friction. Knights wrote verses to ladies they saw once across a feast hall. Noble women fell ill from unrequited passion. Lovers exchanged tokens, a ribbon, a glove, a handkerchief, and read into every movement like it was scripture. And yes, in many cases things went well beyond poetry. Letters were passed under doors, secret meetings arranged at tournaments or hunts. There were rules, always rules, but part of the thrill was breaking them without getting caught. In fact, courtly love had its own etiquette manuals. Entire books were written detailing how to woo, how to pine, how to act when your beloved passed by. The De Amor by Andreas Capellanus, circa 1185, reads like a medieval dating guide mixed with a theological treatise. It lays out 21 rules of love, including "He who is not jealous cannot love," and "Marriage is no excuse for not loving." Bold statements for a world obsessed with sin. And here's the thing. While courtly love was meant to be non-physical, it was ridiculously erotic. The language dripped with longing. Writers described aching limbs, sleepless nights, trembling hands, lips that burned from unsaid words. There's an entire genre of poems, albus or dawn songs, about lovers who must part before sunrise. They lie together in secret, whispering goodbyes, listening for the watchman's horn. The eroticism lives in the almost touch, the almost kiss, the almost confession. It wasn't all high poetry either. Some songs and tales were deeply bawdy, filled with euphemism and innuendo. A knight praises his lady's flower, a common metaphor that never meant flowers. A maiden speaks of her castle, and how few are allowed inside. The metaphors aren't exactly subtle, but they were wrapped in enough art to pass muster. Courtly love became a tool of the powerful. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most influential queens of the medieval world, helped popularize it by patronizing troubadours and hosting courts of love, gatherings where noble women judged cases of romance and issued verdicts. Some of these courts were symbolic, others were real enough to leave records. One document from 1174 recounts a case where a woman asked whether it was more honourable to be loved by one man deeply or many men lightly. The judges debated. Poems were read. The decision? One man, but only if he suffered attractively. But as the ideal spread, so did its contradictions. The Church, of course, hated courtly love. It saw it as glorified adultery, lust in verse. Priests railed against it from pulpits, calling it spiritual corruption wrapped in rhyme. They weren't wrong. Many courtly love tales involved infidelity, and not just metaphorical. Take Lancelot and Guinevere, the most famous example. Their love brings down Camelot. And yet, it's portrayed as noble. Tragic, yes, but deeply human. And let's talk about the women. Noble women were supposed to be passive objects of devotion, the light in a man's dark world. But in many cases they were active participants. They wrote poetry, answered letters, made the first move. Some used courtly love as a kind of power lever, balancing favours and flattery to gain political or social advantage. A woman with suitors had influence. A lady with a lovesick knight might get better land terms, military support, or simply better gossip. Here's your fringe fact for the evening. Some noblewomen employed love scribes, young clerics or secretaries tasked with drafting, copying, and sometimes even reading aloud love letters. Imagine being the poor scribe caught between a duchess and her half-literary, half-lusty admirers. My lady bids me to say she finds your verse pleasing, though she questions your use of the word lance. But not all stories ended well. Some affairs, once exposed, led to banishment or worse. A nobleman caught with the Queen's lady-in-waiting might find himself on the business end of a duel. A woman caught with a priest might be sent to a convent for moral rehabilitation. Courtly love was thrilling, but it was dangerous. The very thing that made it exciting, its illicit nature, was also what made it volatile. So why did people risk it? Because in a world full of arranged marriages, strict inheritance laws and suffocating expectations, courtly love offered a fantasy of choice, even if that choice was only in whispers, in glances, in letters no one would ever read aloud. Historians still argue over whether courtly love reflected actual behaviour or just idealised longing. Some see it as the birth of modern romantic love, others say it was performance art, controlled rebellion within rigid norms. Maybe it was both. Back in the court, the music has shifted to a slower rhythm. A young knight bows too low before a duchess. She barely smiles. He doesn't see her hand slip something into his palm. A folded piece of parchment. No words, just perfume. He pockets it like it's nothing. But you can tell by the way he stands afterward. Spine straighter, shoulders squared. He's just been knighted in another way entirely. The parchment crackles as the scribe unrolls it with a reverent kind of flair, eyes narrowed like he's reading something sacred or scandalous. You're seated on a bench in the shadowy corner of a small stone chamber, along with a dozen others. Some are clergy, some are noblemen. One or two are local officials whose expressions hover between fascination and dread. The topic at hand? Not taxes, not war, not heresy. It's a book. Or more accurately, a list of books, because tonight's council has been summoned to decide which writings are too dangerous, too lascivious, or too rebellious to be allowed in circulation. Welcome to the secret bookshelf of forbidden texts, that murky underworld of medieval literature where love, lust, and language refuse to stay in their assigned roles. The Church loved books. It preserved them, copied them, catalogued them. Monasteries functioned like massive hard drives for classical and religious knowledge. But it also feared them, because a book, unlike a sermon, could whisper directly to your thoughts, unsupervised. It could suggest things, complicate things. It could make you feel things. And when those feelings trailed even slightly into desire, seduction, or God forbid pleasure, the Church leaned in fast with ink-stained fingers and a fire pit nearby. Let's be clear, there was no single index of forbidden books in the high medieval period, not yet. That came later, during the Renaissance and Reformation, when the printing press made texts harder to control. But medieval Europe still had its informal blacklist. Monks, bishops, and councils kept records of improper reading. Sometimes these books were banned outright. Other times they were edited, censored, or quietly relocated to the restricted section of a monastery's library, only accessible by permission of the abbot, you know, the good section. Among the most notorious texts were the love manuals, guides on seduction, romantic strategy, and bedroom techniques. One example, De Amor by Andreas Capellanus, the same guy we mentioned back in the courtly love section. It was wildly popular but walked a dangerous line. Written in the 12th century, it included hypothetical conversations between lovers, advice on how to win affection, and, somewhat awkwardly, chapters arguing against love entirely. Scholars still argue whether Capellanus meant it as satire. But the Church wasn't laughing. In some monastic libraries the book was chained to a desk, viewable only under supervision. Even older texts caused anxiety. The rediscovery of Ovid's Ars Amatoria, The Art of Love, sparked no small amount of panic among the pious. It was Roman, poetic, and basically a sex ed course disguised as flirtation advice. Some church fathers labelled it pagan filth. Others admired the elegance of its Latin and taught it in university, while insisting their students focus on the form, not the content. Spoiler, students did not. Then there were the fabliaux, short, bawdy French tales often passed around orally before being written down. These stories were raunchy, hilarious, and deeply inappropriate. They featured lusty priests, cheating wives, horny peasants, and outlandishly graphic metaphors involving turnips and barnyard animals. One popular fabliau involved a monk who convinces a naive woman that the devil lives in her vagina and must be exorcised by, well, you can guess. These were not meant for Sunday reading, and yet they circulated widely, because even monks had ears, and some had quills. In fact, copies of these fabliaux exist in manuscripts copied by religious scribes. Did they laugh while transcribing? Did they roll their eyes? Or did they read them late at night, behind closed doors, heart thumping in the flicker of a single candle? The Church tried to push back. Some bishops ordered book burnings. Others demanded that scribes redact offending passages. There's a 13th century manuscript in which every occurrence of the word amore, to love, is scratched out and replaced with timer, to fear. That says a lot about their priorities. But the problem with forbidden books is simple. Once someone hears a book is dangerous, they want to read it more. Here's your fringe fact. Monasteries had what some modern scholars call locked libraries, small collections of controversial or restricted texts stored in hidden cupboards or behind iron gates. Access was limited. Sometimes only the abbot or librarian held the key. But we have records of monks bribing or blackmailing each other for late-night access. One particularly poetic monk wrote, "The key to the gate is shaped like temptation." That's not metaphor. That's lived experience. Even theological texts weren't always safe. Works by early Christian mystics, especially female mystics, were often viewed as suspect, especially if they included graphic descriptions of spiritual ecstasy that sounded a little too physical. St. Teresa of Avila, centuries later, would write of angels piercing her heart with divine fire, but she wasn't the first. Some medieval women described their visions in terms of being embraced or entered by the Holy Spirit. To the right reader, or the wrong one, these weren't just metaphors, and the Church, ever paranoid, sometimes banned or edited these writings too. But perhaps the most telling contradiction lies in the Church's secret approval of some of these texts. Yes, officially they were forbidden, but unofficially, priests and scholars quoted them, bishops borrowed lines. Even the papal court was known to host poets whose work flirted with impropriety. It was as if they believed certain words were acceptable so long as they were dressed up in Latin and read aloud with a frown. Historians still argue whether this tension was a moral crisis, or simply the natural collision of repression and literacy. The more people could read, the harder it became to control what they read. And once reading included not just prayer books, but poetry and prose that stirred something deeper, curiosity, desire, memory, the Church's neat walls began to crack. You glance back at the scribe as he seals up the scroll again. The council has decided. Another book will be hidden, possibly burned, but you notice the scribe pocketing a small scrap of parchment before he leaves. A quote, perhaps. A line too lovely to lose, or maybe just a joke too filthy to forget. Either way, it survives. Passed from hand to hand, memorized, whispered, written again. Because even in a world of stone churches and trembling confessions, stories know how to hide, especially the juicy ones. You wake to bells, but they're not church bells this time. They're smaller, lighter, tied to the wrists and ankles of a jester spinning through the great hall, surrounded by a mix of laughter, spilled wine, and the kind of merriment that begins to feel slightly dangerous the longer it goes unchecked. Someone's playing a drum far too enthusiastically. A roast pig is paraded past with an apple in its mouth, and a nobleman you recognise as particularly pious is currently making animal noises to impress a veiled girl half his age. The banner overhead says it all. Feast of Fools. And suddenly, you realise where we are. Tonight, we've stepped into the rowdiest, most ridiculous contradiction of medieval morality. Holy days gone horny. That's right. Despite centuries of stern-faced sermons about virtue and self-denial, medieval Europe had a habit, an annual habit in fact, of throwing all that out the window in favour of public chaos, costumed reversal, and behaviour so indecent it would make even a seasoned bishop raise his eyebrows. Let's call it what it was. A state-sanctioned moral jailbreak. The Feast of Fools, celebrated mostly between Christmas and Epiphany, was originally meant to give clergy and choir boys a break from liturgical duties, a bit of innocent fun. But it quickly morphed into something far less innocent. In cathedrals across France, Germany and England, subdeacons and lower clergy would dress as bishops and hold mock services filled with gibberish Latin, donkey brays and absurd processions. Yes, someone literally led a donkey into church to the chant, hee-haw, hee-haw, hee-haw. The crowd would cheer. Priests would be jeered, and that was just the warm-up. Outside the cathedral, the real show began. Drunken parades, masks, impromptu plays stuffed with innuendo, and the kind of cross-dressing that managed to offend both church rules and local sumptuary laws. A canon might show up in a nun's habit. A bishop's page might don a devil costume and chase choir boys with a wooden phallus. Again, not satire. This actually happened. The entire social order was flipped on its head, and lust ran through it all like spilled communion wine. One of the church's own records from 1445 laments that, during the Feast of Fools, priests dance in the choir dressed as women, sing obscene songs in place of psalms, and play dice upon the altar. Another account from Beauvais describes a mock bishop urinating from the pulpit, while choir boys threw sausage casings at the nave. It wasn't subtle, and it definitely wasn't in the gospel. So, why did they allow it? Simple. Pressure release. Medieval life was hard. War, famine, plague, and constant moral scrutiny could wear anyone down. The church may have feared sin, but it feared rebellion even more. So these feast days, like the Feast of Fools or the carnival season leading into Lent, became controlled burn zones. Let people act wild for a few days, and they're less likely to explode the rest of the year. Better to tolerate a week of sin in costume than a year of quiet resentment. And make no mistake, These festivals were steeped in sexuality. Carnival, especially with its masks, masquerades and public dances, was a breeding ground for flirtation, infidelity and outright debauchery. In Venice, Florence and other cities that embraced the festival, costumes provided both anonymity and freedom. A married woman in a lace mask could flirt without consequence. A monk could dance with a courtesan without scandal, at least until the sun came up. One documented carnival game involved a giant wheel labelled with erotic dares. Participants spun it and were commanded to kiss, fondle or recite a dirty limerick to the nearest stranger. Think of it as a medieval version of Spin the Bottle, with more layers and better poetry. Even Lent, the supposedly solemn season that followed Carnival, couldn't fully erase the afterglow. One bishop wrote in 1307, "We begin Lent not with ashes, but with rumours of who kissed whom beneath which mask." No surprise, then, that in many cities church authorities tried, unsuccessfully, to clamp down. Edicts were issued, masks were banned, dances were outlawed, people danced anyway. But perhaps the most paradoxical of these holy festivals was the boy bishop tradition, where a choir boy was elected to act as bishop during the feast of St. Nicholas. He wore full vestments, gave mock sermons, and even issued blessings. Though intended as light-hearted imitation, some ceremonies grew bawdy fast. One infamous case from York in 1380 records a boy bishop who appointed his own choir of virgins, played by fellow boys in wigs and padded gowns, and led them in a drunken parade where the gospel was replaced with verses from a love ballad. Now here's your fringe fact. In some towns, these festivals became the preferred setting for secret rendezvous. The anonymity of the crowd, the distraction of spectacle, and the loosened moral expectations made it easier for lovers to meet, for affairs to spark, and for arranged marriages to be temporarily disregarded. One noblewoman, writing under a pseudonym in a 15th century letter, confessed that she met my true love masked, and though I knew not his name, I knew his breath. That's either deeply romantic or the beginning of a medieval scandal novel. And yes, the church absolutely tried to stamp it all out. Synods were held, priests were punished, a few entire parishes were placed under interdict, a form of spiritual lockdown, for failing to rein in the revelry. But here's the twist. Even the bishops who condemned the celebrations were often seen attending them, in disguise of course. So what does this all mean? Were medieval people just hypocrites? Maybe. But more likely they were deeply human, living in a culture that preached absolute chastity, while quietly building escape hatches for the desires it couldn't contain. These holy days were never just about prayer. They were about the things we pretend we don't want until we've had enough wine to admit we do. As the feast winds down, you catch the jester slipping behind the tapestry with a veiled woman. No one stops them. A deacon yawns and pours another cup of wine. The makeshift altar has been cleared of dice, but the memory of the laughter still echoes through the hall. Tomorrow they'll repent. Tomorrow the sermons will scold, but tonight, even the saints are smiling. The wind outside howls like it's trying to remember a song, something half forgotten and full of grief. Inside, the chamber is hushed, heavy with incense and the crackle of wood in a modest hearth. You sit beside a priest, not a fire and brimstone preacher, not one of the opulent bishops who rides through town like a prince, but a gaunt, sleep-deprived, middle-ranking cleric whose collar is frayed, and whose eyes are rimmed with the colour of too many secrets. He's just finished hearing confession, and if you think the sins he hears are all about stolen bread or skipped prayers, you're in for a surprise. Tonight, we delve into the haunted, intimate space of the confessional and bedroom sins, where medieval anxieties, personal guilt, and institutional obsession collided behind a screen of whispered admissions. It's hard to overstate how central confession became to medieval life, especially after the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 made it mandatory once a year. Everyone, man, woman, noble, peasant, was expected to confess their sins annually to their parish priest. No excuses, no exceptions. And while the idea was rooted in spiritual guidance and reconciliation, it quickly became something far more intrusive, more forensic, and, at times, disturbingly voyeuristic. By the 13th century, priests were trained using penitentials, guidebooks that listed sins and appropriate penances like some kind of divine tax code. And the details. These manuals didn't just say fornication or lust. They broke it down with unsettling specificity. Have you had intercourse outside of marriage? Sure. With a virgin? With a widow? In what position? On what days? Did you enjoy it? Yes, that last one was a real question, because in the eyes of many confessors, pleasure, especially female pleasure, was suspicious on its own. For a culture supposedly terrified of sex, the Church had an encyclopedic interest in the mechanics of it. Penitential manuals asked questions about frequency, intention, orifices, climaxes, birth control, and even dreams. You could be required to confess to sexual thoughts you had while asleep, or during Mass, or while watching a goose waddle past in a particularly suggestive manner. Seriously, animal metaphors were everywhere, and not always symbolic. And yet, this wasn't just about prurient curiosity, it was about control. The confessional wasn't just a place of cleansing, it was a surveillance tool, an early medieval wiretap of the soul. Priests knew who was cheating, who was gay, who was secretly sleeping with their cousin, and while confession was supposed to be confidential, seal of the confessional, remember, priests were also part of the social web. They knew things, and sometimes those things got out. Confessing was nerve-wracking. For women especially. Picture it. A young woman, alone, face to face with the spiritual authority of her village, asked to recount her most private sins, often in a way that assumed she had committed them. Some priests were gentle, some were manipulative. There are accounts, rare but real, of clergy using confession to groom or coerce. If you want absolution, you must prove your contrition, one friar reportedly told a frightened girl in Flanders. She ran. Others didn't. At the same time, for many the confessional was one of the only places to talk about sexual feelings without punishment. A safe space, relatively speaking. A widow could admit to loneliness. A man could whisper about his attraction to other men. A wife might confide that she hated sex with her husband. The priest, bound by his role, listened. And sometimes they responded with compassion. Other times with penance that seems absurd in retrospect. Say 1,000 Hail Marys, fast for 40 days. Avoid meat and touch for an entire season. The range of punishments depended not just on the sin, but on your social standing. A noblewoman confessing to adultery might be told to donate to the church. A servant girl, she could be exiled from the parish entirely. A wealthy man who visited prostitutes was often given a prayer regimen. A beggar caught doing the same might be publicly flogged. Birth control, by the way, was absolutely a sin. Not because of modern moral arguments, but because the church believed every act of intercourse must be open to procreation. Withdrawal, herbal contraceptives, even timed abstinence during a woman's fertile period were all frowned upon. If a woman confessed to using moon tea to avoid pregnancy, she might be assigned a lifetime of penance, and yet midwives across Europe quietly kept the recipes alive. One fringe case from 14th century Bohemia involved a married couple who confessed to role-playing. Yes, really. The man dressed as a knight and the wife as a captured princess. The priest was so scandalized he wrote to the bishop, who responded with a long letter, comparing such behaviour to paganism and advised that they live as brother and sister from now on. Because clearly, nothing restores marital health like cold celibacy. Scholars still argue about whether medieval people truly believed every sexual act was sinful. Some say they did, pointing to the constant confession of bedroom behaviour. Others argue people were simply playing the game, confessing what was expected, receiving a formulaic penance, and going right back to their lives, like a holy laundry cycle: rinse, sin, repeat. Interestingly, some priests began to question the entire setup. A few 15th century texts hint at concern. Were people actually improving, or just becoming better at confessing theatrically? One confessor complained that his parishioners speak of sin like it is story, and warned that too much focus on detail could encourage the very behaviours they were supposed to suppress. Imagine sitting through 50 versions of "I accidentally touched myself while thinking of Lady Eleanor," and trying to maintain spiritual neutrality. And yet, not all confession was negative. For many, it was a lifeline. A moment to speak truthfully in a world of silence and shame, to say, "I wanted, I feared, I failed," and to hear, even after that, "Go in peace." There's power in that, even if the institution sometimes wielded it with more calculation than compassion. You glance again at the priest beside you. He hasn't moved in 10 minutes, just stares into the fire. You wonder what sins he's heard tonight. Which one stayed in his ears, unshakable? You wonder what he would confess if there were a screen to hide behind. Outside, the wind dies. The last penitent leaves, cloak wrapped tightly, head bowed, and the room is still again, full of secrets that will never be spoken, except maybe in a book 100 years later. Dawn creeps over the fields with the kind of soft golden light that makes everything look more honest than it probably is. A rooster crows, a dog barks, and from the edge of the woods the faint thud of an axe hitting wood echoes across the valley. You're standing on a dirt path between two worlds, one that belongs to the village, with its slow churn of daily life, and another that stretches toward the city, filled with noise, rules, officials, and the constant threat of being seen. Welcome to the blurred line where law met habit, where sin met survival, and where we now examine the real divide, town versus country, because if you think medieval sexuality was handled the same way everywhere, you haven't been outside the city walls lately. Let's start in the cities, where things were loud, watched, and heavily regulated. Urban centres like Paris, Florence, Erotics and Cologne had church authorities, secular magistrates and nosy neighbours all within a 10-minute walk of each other. That meant more rules, posted and enforced. Curfews for women, moral patrols, brothel zones, legal marriage registries, even wardrobe regulations designed to mark out respectable women from sex workers. Everything was documented or at least monitored, so if someone committed an illicit act, whether it was premarital sex, adultery, or something even less polite, there was a good chance someone would notice. And if you had enemies, you'd be reported faster than you could untangle your shift. That didn't mean people behaved, of course. Cities were also full of opportunity. Taverns, festivals, bathhouses and long nights. Lovers met in alleyways. Letters passed through servant hands. Some people maintained two lives entirely, one public and one intensely private. But the constant eyes of church and court meant that urban sexuality had to be performed very carefully. It was a dance, and those who stumbled paid for it in shame, fines, or worse. Now, let's leave the cobblestones behind. Out in the countryside, things were different. Not freer necessarily, but quieter, less observed. In small villages and farmsteads, there might be one priest, one manor lord, and the rest. Just regular people trying to get through the season. They didn't have written records of every marriage or a vice squad to track behaviour. Most of what happened, especially behind hay bales, inside barns or during May Day festivals, stayed local. It might spark gossip, it might anger a parent, but it didn't always result in public punishment. In fact, medieval rural life had a kind of flexibility the city lacked. Marriage, for instance, wasn't always a formal process. Canon law said marriage required mutual consent and consummation, not a priest or witnesses. So couples often married themselves with simple vows. Some were later blessed in church, others never were. If a couple lived together, farmed together and raised children, the community might just accept it. Was it legal? Questionable. But in practice, it worked. The same looseness applied to sexual norms. Premarital sex was technically a sin, but in the countryside, betrothal often came with certain expectations. A girl might get pregnant before the wedding and no one would blink, so long as a marriage followed quickly. Illegitimacy wasn't ideal, but it wasn't an automatic disgrace either. Families negotiated, dowries were adjusted, the priest grumbled and said a few extra prayers, life went on. One famous anthropological study of rural England found that some villages tolerated bundling, a courtship custom where an engaged couple was allowed to sleep in the same bed, clothed supposedly, to foster intimacy before marriage. Sometimes a board was placed between them. Sometimes there was no board. Everyone knew what was likely happening. But as long as there was an intention to wed, the community mostly shrugged. In short, rural sex culture was deeply pragmatic. These were people who had little time for luxury or pretense. The field needed ploughing, the cow needed birthing, the barn needed mending. And oh, your daughter is 3 months along? Better hurry that wedding then. The church didn't always like this attitude, but in remote parishes, with overworked priests and few alternatives, enforcement was minimal. You can't burn every sinner when the only other literate person in town is the blacksmith. Contrast this with city punishments, public shaming, stocks, penance parades, or exile. In some towns, a man caught in adultery might be forced to walk through the streets wearing a headdress shaped like a penis. A woman, she might be locked in the town square cage while people threw turnips. These were performances of morality as much as justice, designed not just to punish, but to remind everyone else of the cost of indulgence. In the country, no town square, no turnips to spare. Punishments were more informal, a broken engagement, a public scolding, a sermon directed very obviously at a particular pew, but also more permanent in some ways. Reputation meant everything in small communities. A young woman labelled fast might struggle to find a husband. A man who abandoned a pregnant lover might face not law, but communal coldness, neighbours refusing to trade, share tools, or help during harvest. And yet, the country also had room for secrets. Affairs, same-sex encounters, and quiet liaisons happened just as often, maybe more. The woods were good for that, so were long walks to water. With no formal surveillance, people found their own ways of navigating desire. Some were caught, some never were. And when the church did find out, it usually came months later through gossip relayed from one town to the next, warped and embellished like a medieval game of telephone. One fringe case from Bavaria in the 14th century involved a rural priest who fathered 7 children with different women in his parish. Everyone knew. No one reported him. Why? Because he was also the best healer for miles, and no one wanted to lose the only man who could fix a broken leg and deliver a midnight mass during lambing season. Eventually, the bishop found out and removed him. The village protested, loudly. The replacement priest lasted 3 weeks. So what do we take from all this? That the medieval world wasn't one thing. It was layers, tangled and often contradictory. The laws were clear, but the enforcement inconsistent. The sermons were loud, but the fields were quiet, and between the town squares and the pastures, people carved out their own truths, half sacred, half scandalous. As the sun climbs, you watch smoke rise from chimney pots in the village below. In the distance, the cathedral spire glints tall and stern, but here, in the middle, there's only dirt beneath your boots and breath in your lungs. A girl with a basket passes by. She hums a song that sounds like it's older than both church and city. You don't know the words, but you understand the tune.